I had a really horrible experience during a summer trip for our school program. It was a JROTC summer camp, and for those of you not familiar with the program, it basically gives you basic military understanding. You go on runs, do marching commands, stuff like that. It's offered in most high schools in the United States. I come from a family of military professionals, so it just seemed like a logical choice. Even though I didn't plan on joining the military myself, I am a pretty short girl. My name is Caitlin, and during camp I met a nice guy. He was in my squad during a particular practice exercise, and I thought he was a really great guy. We didn't get to spend too much time together, though. The boys and the girls slept in separate buildings, and most of the time, we didn't get placed in the same squad for activities. I remember thinking that he was really funny and cute. He was one of those guys who somehow had the ability to make jokes that didn't have to hurt anyone's feelings, and I always thought that was rare. If you think about it, it's really difficult. When was the last time you made a joke that wasn't at the expense of someone else? So I guess I valued that, and it was one of the things that attracted me to him. Like I said, we didn't get to spend a lot of time together, and it just made me want to be with him more. We exchanged phone numbers on the last day in the hopes that we would date sometime after we got out. We kept in touch for the following weeks, and everything seemed good. The only problem was that he lived about 30 minutes away from me. We were both seniors in high school, and that is a long trip for someone that makes minimum wage part-time. We talked on and off again for a few months, but it didn't really go anywhere, and I just figured that I would let it die. That was until around late October. He started talking to me a lot. I remember we became really close, and we talked on the phone a whole bunch and were texting each other obsessively. My family got mad at me at Thanksgiving because I was on my phone the whole time, and I could not get enough of him. He seemed so interested in me. I later found out this because he had just broken up with his girlfriend. I didn't even know that he was in a relationship, but yeah, he got interested in me once he was out of that last relationship. He still kind of flirted with me before, though. Still not sure how I feel about that, and it seemed kind of sketchy. I remember at one point the conversation just became a little dry for me. I got a little less interested. Not exactly sure why, he just seemed so into me. He texted me obsessively, even a few weeks later, and my interest started to wane. That's when he started getting really brave over text messages. He would say really intimate, almost too personal things to me, even started sending me dirty pictures of himself. And not just regular pictures, like very dirty pictures, if that gives you any kind of inclination. This one time he kept saying that he wanted to sleep at my house. He said that he could borrow his mom's car over the weekend, but he didn't want to drive all the way back until the next day. He kept asking if he could just sleep in my house. Obviously, my mom would have said no. She wasn't the kind of parent that would just let a boy sleep over, and my dad would have murdered him if he had ever found out that he was trying to sleep over. Well, he just showed up one day. Literally just came to my house. I mean, what in God's name was he thinking? I had given him my address before, but this was completely unannounced, and we had been talking for months prior. It was just a really freaky and unexpected thing. He brought me flowers and chocolate, the whole thing that would be really sweet if it wasn't so creepy. It just gave me a really bad vibe. I ended up spending the day with him. We went to the park down the street and got coffee, but he still insisted on trying to sleep over. I told him no, and after getting a little pushy, he gave in and drove home at about 11 at night. Other than the weirdness, the day didn't go that bad. I did still find him funny and charming. I just had some subtle warning signs about him that made me a little uncomfortable, and looking back, I should have paid more attention to those. Now here's the crazy time that put our relationship to an end. He tried getting me to sleep over at his house. He began getting really forceful. At one point, he threatened to hurt me if I didn't try to sleep over at his house. I kept trying to tell him that my parents would not let me sleep over at a boy's home, but he didn't care. It was a big ultimatum, and that was that. I know. Messed up, but he had me under his spell, and it worked. And here's how he tried to spin it to my parents. He had a younger sister, and I tried telling my mom that I wanted to sleep over at my friend's house. That was the girl. And I wanted her to drive me over there. Keep in mind, I didn't have my car or a learner's permit or anything. I was kind of scared of driving, if I'm going to be honest. Anyway, I just told my parents that I wanted to sleep at a friend's house, and they were completely on board. They didn't have a problem with it, obviously. I had done it many times before. My mom drove me over there, and when we got there, the only person home was him, and his family wasn't coming back until Monday. He didn't even tell me that he was home alone for the weekend. My mom had no idea that there was going to be no parental supervision. She is kind of overbearing with stuff like that, so she asked him to speak with his parents. She just wanted to double-check that everything was good, and that they were okay with the situation. Well, as you might imagine, it wasn't long before my mom figured the situation out. She drove me back home, and that was the end of that whole situation. I texted him and asked him why didn't he tell me that no one was going to be home, and he literally told me that he was going to do horrible things to me. He got mad at me because he wasted his entire family vacation time on trying to get freaky with me, and he didn't get to do anything. I thought he was just playing some kind of joke on me, but then he started sending me pictures of some weird torture stuff. I don't know if they were weird toys or what. He specifically told me something he was going to make his dog do to me. Yeah, some pretty sick stuff. And I was freaking horrified after that. I had no idea that he was such a freak. I always had a bad feeling about him, but I never listened to that voice in the back of my head. Anyway, my mom told me I wasn't allowed to talk to him anymore, and she was really unhappy that I was being deceitful with her, and I can understand that. If it hadn't been for my mom, God only knows what would have happened. To this day, I still don't really know why I went along with everything for so long. It was like he had me hypnotized or something. I haven't spoken to or heard from him since, and I don't think I want to, either. I don't remember exactly how old I was at the time, maybe 14 or 15. I had this really crazy guy that lived on my street. Everyone called him Crazy Mike, and he really was as crazy as you could imagine, but more on him in a minute. I had this one friend that was a little wild. We'll call him Charlie. He was kind of the adventurous friend that got me to do some crazy stuff. We went through a phase for about 2 or 3 months where we hung out a lot, and it was honestly a lot of fun. One of the things we would do was explore the nearby woods. There was a lot of wildlife, and anyone could go out there and explore as far as they wanted. We lived on a mountain, and we would hike up the mountain, and when we had enough for the day, we would hike back down. We normally took the regular roads back down because it was just a little bit easier to get home that way. My friend lived a few roads up from me, so I would walk up to his house with him and then go home by myself. I remember this one particular day we had gone hiking through the creek. Bear in mind, it was freezing outside at the time. There was snow on the ground and a lot of water was frozen. At one point, we had the bright idea of walking on the ice. As you might imagine, we fell into the water. It wasn't very deep or anything, not even enough to get above our chest, but we were dripping with water, and it was about 5 degrees outside, and there was snow on the ground. But being the crazy kids we were, it didn't stop us. We just continued hiking even after we got soaking wet. I don't know if we just had a really high tolerance to the cold or it was adrenaline, and we were all good. We continued on for a couple of hours that day. But after a certain point, I finally talked him into heading home for the day. He agreed, and we went out and got on the road. We made our way back down like usual. But this is the point when I started freezing. I was too cold, and I knew my body. I knew that I was in some kind of danger, like getting near hypothermia or something. When we got to my friend's house, he was more than willing to let me come in and warm up for a few minutes. But just as we were getting to his house, my mom called him. She was really angry with me because I hadn't answered my phone in an hour. I tried explaining the situation to her, but she just screamed at me over and over again to come home. So I had to walk the rest of the way home, and that was that. This is where Crazy Mike comes in, because he lives one road above me, and it saves me about 10 minutes of walking if I cut through a part of his property to get to my house. He had a big fence, but so did his neighbor. There was a small walkway kind of area between the two spots. I was obviously in a rush to get back home and warm up. In fact, I was jogging most of the way. I hadn't heard anything about Crazy Mike by this point, so I figured it would be okay if I cut through his property this one time. I started going through, and that's when he came out of his house with a rifle. He pointed at me and started screaming at me like a maniac. Of course, I turned around and sprinted away. I ran all the way back home and told my mother. She thought I was exaggerating and that I shouldn't have been cutting through people's property anyway, and that was when I started asking people around the area about him. I heard some stories about Crazy Mike and some of the things he would do. I heard that he was a conspiracy theorist, a drug dealer, criminal, felon, and a bunch of other nutty stuff. If I had to sum it all up in a single phrase, he was a bad guy. Whoever I asked never had anything good to say about him, and the part that freaked me out was that I still had to pass Crazy Mike's house on my way home. I didn't have to cut through his property, but I did still have to walk in front of his house on the road to get to my house, and that made me terribly uncomfortable. Because now I was constantly worried that I was going to get shot or something. I still would go hiking with Charlie and all that, and after a couple of times of going home, there was no incident, so I thought that was going to be the end of it. However, I noticed something else. He had video cameras on the outside of his property looking out onto the road. I'd never noticed them before, but now that I was aware of his insanity, I paid a little bit more attention. Whenever I walked by, the cameras would follow me. What freaked me out the most was that they were manually operated cameras. They weren't the kind of cameras that just followed motion around. He was sitting there operating those cameras every single time I ever walked by, watching me. I'm not sure if he was recording all the footage or not, but he made me uncomfortable either way. I remember there was this one time when I was walking home from Charlie's house at night. It must have been about 10 or 11. It was really late, and even then, the cameras followed me as I walked by. I thought that was going to be it, that nothing else was going to happen between me and Crazy Mike. Well, I was dead wrong. It was still during the same winter season, and I was walking home during a blizzard. And that was just the kind of guy I was. My mom was going to order pizza that night, and I didn't want to miss it. I passed by Crazy Mike's like I always did, and that was when something unexpected happened. He had this giant fence, and it had to have been 15 feet tall, and it was this really thick wood. Part of it opened up, and a dog ran out after me. I couldn't tell what kind of dog it was, but it was angry and barking at me really loud, and ran after me, and I could tell that it was going to bite me as hard as it could. I got a seriously violent vibe. I was lucky that I was in really good shape and managed to sprint away, having a head start. Didn't slip or anything else either. That situation could have turned out really bad, really fast. But either way, my family ended up moving a few weeks later for unrelated reasons. My mom actually got a new job in a different state, and that was the end of my experience with Crazy Mike. Even now I wonder what his problem was. Was he some kind of drug dealer or criminal? Why was he so paranoid about some kid walking in front of his house or cutting through a piece of his property? I've asked my friend on Facebook a couple of times if he's heard anything about Crazy Mike, and apparently nothing has changed. So make of that what you will. I guess the moral of the story is that you should avoid crazy people as much as you can. Sometimes just walking in front of their house is enough to set them off. I consider myself a very romantic girl. I've always loved the idea of romance, and I've always wanted a really happy relationship, and that was probably why I had a serious relationship that started when I was a freshman in high school. The guy I met was kind of nerdy, but he was super sweet to me. I remember he brought me flowers in school one time, and that completely won me over. We dated for a couple of years, all throughout high school actually, and even into college. We ended up going to the same community college as well. I really thought that we were going to end up getting married. I even secretly started planning our wedding. Of course, I didn't say anything about that to him because I didn't want to freak him out, but it was on my mind. But one day, something about him changed. I couldn't exactly tell you what, but he became a little bit too possessive. I always knew he was a jealous person, and I did my best to be sensitive to that, but it's not overwhelming after a certain point. I had a chemistry class, and I got paired with a guy to work on a project. We had to do some work outside of the class, and you already know how my boyfriend reacts. I told him I couldn't hang out one day because I had to be at the library to get some work done. He seemed a little suspicious about it. I almost always made time for him. He wasn't used to getting told no. Me and my chemistry partner were almost done with our project. We made a lot of good progress, and I was sure that we were going to make a good grade, but that was when my boyfriend showed up at the library, and oh my god, he made such a scene. It was the worst thing ever. He started freaking out. He tried fighting my chemistry partner. He just kept yelling at me that he was trying to spend time with me, and I lied to him to spend time with another guy. He was literally hysterical. He thought I was cheating on him, but nothing I said stopped him. He just kept going. And everyone in the library was staring at us. The librarian didn't even intervene. They just let the whole thing continue. Finally, I told my boyfriend that we were over. I said it really loud and very firm, and that was the only thing that got him to stop. He made the most broken facial expression I'd ever seen, and he stormed out. After that whole experience, I decided that I really didn't want to be with him. He was just too jealous. I talked with him later on the phone that night, and I explained that I was planning on breaking up with him anyway. But that whole fiasco in the library was a serious tipping point for me. He still thought I was cheating on him with the guy in the library, and I was honestly done fighting about it. He said that he was willing to try and work it out no matter what. He said that he didn't want to lose me. He really wasn't taking it well. It finally got to the point where he was begging me to stay with him, and I just couldn't tell him no anymore. I finally told him goodbye and just hung up. Looking back, I don't know how else I could have responded to that whole situation. He was really difficult, and this is the point when he started stalking me. And it was small stuff at first, like I would notice him at the same stores. He just always happened to be there. Of course, he was just looking at me. He would see me look at him, and then he would look away or pretend like he was looking at his phone. But I knew that he was watching me. I remember it got really bad during the winter, actually. He would come to my house and write me messages in my car in the snow. He would say things like he's sorry and that he would change and that he forgives me. Every single thing in the world, he tried to say it. He was willing to do anything to get me back, but I didn't want to be with him. And the more he tried, the more it creeped me out. I remember doing this really weird thing outside of my one philosophy class. There were glass windows, and I had a seat next to the windows, and he would sit on the bench outside and stare at me every single class. It was horrible. There was no escaping him. And one day, things finally went too far. Now, my family had always gotten a cabin for Christmas. My parents and two sisters would stay in this cabin in the woods and spend time together. My family wasn't very big on spending a bunch of money on gifts that people didn't really want. Call us communist, but the family time was much more special, and I really enjoyed that tradition. My ex-boyfriend knew about this cabin. In fact, we brought him with us one time, so he knew where it was. And I remember it very vividly. It was snowing, we had a fire going, we were drinking eggnog and enjoying Christmas cookies. We were having a really good time. I went outside for a smoke break, and I was just sitting on the rocking chair outside. This was when I saw something in the woods. I got really nervous that it was a bear. That was always our big fear when we stayed in that cabin. There was always the possibility of a bear. But I squinted my eyes a little bit and noticed that it was no animal. It was my ex-boyfriend. When I first noticed, I screamed. I ran back inside and told my family. They already knew that my ex was a total creep, so we all got prepared. My dad went outside and chased him away. My dad said that he chased my ex-boyfriend for about a quarter mile through the woods. He figured that was far enough and that he wasn't going to come back, especially since we were going to have the cops notified about the situation. We did our best not to let him ruin our Christmas cabin time, but we all felt a little uneasy after that, even though we knew that he was probably harmless. It just felt a little uncomfortable after that, at least for me. My family was very supportive about the situation, though. It's been a little while since the whole situation, and I still see him from time to time, and it's really bad. He doesn't really reach out to me anymore, but I know he still watches me a lot. Getting a restraining order almost feels like being too precocious. I don't want to be mean about it, but at the same time, I really want to move on from him. Some of my friends have been talking me into getting a restraining order on him, though, and I might. Looking back, I shouldn't have been such a romantic. There were a lot of warning signs that I missed. He was a seriously messed up individual, and I ignored every single warning sign there was, and there were plenty. If you're like me, make sure to understand who it is that you're with. I almost married that guy, all because I built up some fantasy relationship in my head, the way I wanted things to be, but not the way things really are. Make sure you see things for how they really are, and hopefully everything will work out.
I live in Central Florida. My neighborhood is one of those unassuming, quiet suburban havens. Not much happens around here these days. It's important to make that distinction because once upon a time, my neighborhood was terrorized by a serial rapist back in the late 80s. This was before my time, but apparently he used to hide in the bushes along a bike path that runs behind the neighborhood and would attack unexpecting females. It was this series of attacks that led to a strict closing time of 9 o'clock. However, this did not stop the neighborhood kids from venturing the trail after hours, including myself. I'd say this happened around the summer of 2007. Me and a friend of mine, who I'll call Jake, were being a couple of teenage losers and smashing beer bottles against the trees along the trail. I would say that this happened around 10:30 p.m. To give you a general layout of this trail, it was 2 miles long and started at a lake that was located at the far side of the neighborhood. It ran behind the rows of houses and ended at a soccer field that was just outside the neighborhood. The area of the trail right before you get to the field was the narrowest part, with trees suffocating it on either side. Despite any moonlight that may be out at night, rest assured that this particular area would always be pitch black. Jake and I were approaching this part of the path. We planned on messing around the soccer field on the other side. As we got closer to the opening, I started to get a feeling that we were being watched. I motioned for Jake to stop as I listened carefully. "Is anyone there?" I said on a whim. To our surprise, a figure emerged from the darkness of the trees in front of us. Since the trail was closed at the time, the only lights we had were the streetlights out on the main road, which wasn't much, but we could still make out that the figure before us was wearing a dark hoodie with one of those creepy frowning theater masks. The instant I saw the stranger, I felt a cold chill run through my entire body. I'm sure Jake felt it too. We slowly backed away. Jake turned around as I kept my eyes on the frowning man, and the next thing I heard was Jake whispering, "Oh shit." I turned to see what had startled Jake, and there was another hooded figure standing right behind us. It was also wearing a theater mask, except this one was smiling. Jake and I stood back to back as we watched the figures on either side of us begin to walk towards us slowly. I had my eye on the frowning man as Jake watched the other one. I felt another chill crawl up my back as the figure moved closer, revealing a large kitchen knife in its hands. "This guy has a knife," I heard Jake say from behind me. We had to think fast. They were coming at us from both directions. That's when I had an idea. Right before you got to the narrow path, the trail was bordered by residential fences. These fences are fairly tall, but not impossible to scale. "Jake, we have to try to jump the fence and get back out to the main road, or we're dead," I said under my breath. I tried to be as quiet as possible, but the moment those words left my mouth, the frowning man began sprinting towards us.
"Fuck! Go now!"
cried Jake. I assumed that the smiling man was doing the same. We bolted towards the fence. I was the first to reach it. I got into a crouching stance and balled my hands together to launch Jake over. Once Jake was on the other side, I jumped up and started to pull myself up. I then felt a hand grab my ankle and was quickly brought to the ground. I look up and see the frowning man towering over me, with his knife raised up. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. All I could do was watch as my life ended. Suddenly, the frowning man staggered back as he was struck in the head by a large object.
"Kevin, run! There's an opening in the side."
I looked behind me to see Jake perched at the top of the fence. He was pointing to his right. I looked to see that there was a small opening at the far end of the fence. I scrambled to my feet and ran for it. I practically dove through the small hole in the fence, scraped myself up pretty good in the process, but I didn't care. As soon as I got to my feet, a hand shot through the opening and grabbed a hold of my foot, causing me to fall forward. I looked back to see a smiling mask in the fence opening. Jake quickly ran over and stomped on the smiling man's arm. We heard a muffled grunt, and the smiling man withdrew his hand back through the opening. We ran as fast as we could all the way back to my house. After we calmed down, we decided not to call the police, as that would have resulted in Jake going back home and possibly never being allowed back over, as well as me being grounded for a week. So being the narrow-minded dipshits we were, we decided to keep this to ourselves. But you can bet your ass that we never walked that trail after dark again. It's a good thing that we were both in pretty good shape at the time, or we may not have made it out of that situation. I live in the same neighborhood to this day, and even after all these years, I've never heard of anyone else encountering these masked men. I guess we were just lucky that night. I'm not much of a storyteller, so bear with me. During the 90s, I went through a very rough time in my life. After a failed marriage, I became a bit of a nomad, wandering across country on foot with no particular destination. It was a stupid idea, but I was in a very hopeless place back then, and just looking to experience something new. I've been traveling down South Dakota and hitched a ride with a truck driver into Nebraska. For those of you who have never been to that state, there are large sections of land that go on for miles with nothing but cornfields lining either side of the road. We split ways at a rest stop, and I made my way into what I now know to be the Sand Hills of Nebraska. The Sand Hills region is one of the most isolated areas in the United States, 20,000 square miles of nothing but dunes and prairies. I planned on hitchhiking my way to the nearest town and catching a bus to visit a friend I had in Omaha. Full disclosure, I had absolutely no idea what the hell I was doing. I subscribed to the "I'll figure it out when I get there" mentality. At the time, I didn't know a whole lot about Nebraska, but I found out the hard way that this stretch of road was not ideal for hitchhiking. I barely saw any cars going down this road, and the ones that did completely ignored me. 12 hours had passed, and I was running low on food and water. I was utterly exhausted at this point, and I needed to find a place to rest for a while. I had about an hour left of daylight. Lucky for me, I happened to come upon an old farmhouse that was situated about a half-mile away from the main road. From a distance, I thought this place may have been occupied, but when I got closer, it was clear to me that this house was abandoned. This was around the fall, so weather in Nebraska wasn't terrible. However, the nights were a bit on the cold side, so I decided to hold up in this house for the night and continue my journey the next day. I had enough supplies to last me one more night. The house was your typical rotting husk. Smelled like mold, severe water damage, creaking floors, etc. The living room seemed to be the only decent place to settle down at, so I unpacked my sleeping bag and eventually dozed off. I woke up to the sound of floorboards creaking. I immediately sat up and listened. I could hear several pairs of footsteps thudding all around the house. They were coming from upstairs, downstairs, on the back porch outside, and even in the same room with me. But I didn't see a thing. I quickly got to my feet and walked over to the nearest window and peered out. What I saw was truly alarming and sent a wave of nausea through my entire body. Several cloaked figures were standing side by side. They appeared to be encircling the house. Because of the footsteps I heard, I thought there may have been people in the house with me. So in an effort to defuse things, I made another big-brain decision and spoke up. Hello? I'm sorry if I'm trespassing. I was just looking for a place to rest for the night. I thought this place was abandoned. Again, I'm sorry." All the footsteps stopped at once. An eerie silence followed. It was so quiet that I could have heard a mouse shitting in the corner. I got this real bad feeling in my gut, so I reached into my backpack and pulled out my hunting knife. I gathered the rest of my things and slowly moved out into the hallway. Aside from the mysterious figures outside, I was also thinking of what was making those footsteps inside the house. As I said, I heard several footsteps when I woke up, so I figured it wouldn't be long before I ran into someone inside the house. But after combing the entire downstairs, I didn't see or hear anything. I could tell something was very off. That bad feeling I mentioned earlier intensified, despite the fact that I knew there was a bunch of weirdos in cloaks waiting for me outside. Something told me that if I didn't leave the house that very moment, something terrible was going to happen to me. The house was located in a wide open clearing. Beyond the clearing was a barrier of tall grass. When I left through the front door, I stopped directly in front of the house. No matter which direction I looked, I saw another hooded menace blocking my way. I suddenly felt this heat on my back. I quickly turned around and was shocked to see that the house I just left was now engulfed in flames. I cannot explain how this happened. Moments before, I was inside that house, walking around, and it was now on fire. I backed away. I decided that I was going to run through the figures and get the hell out of Dodge. But when I turned back around, the figures were nowhere in sight. Things were getting way too bizarre for me at that point. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to get the fuck out of that place. When I got back out to the main road, I didn't stop walking until I finally got to a town, whose name I can't remember. The rest of my time in Nebraska went well, and I got my life together shortly after I got back home from my trip. As long as I live, I'll never forget that old farmhouse and those mysterious cloaked figures. This incident still baffles me to this day, but perhaps some things are best left unanswered. I'm a female in her 30s. I was born and raised in Gainesville, Florida. About a decade ago, while I was still in college, I would often take babysitting jobs to make extra money. I usually would watch Mrs. Gruder's two young boys named Ashton and Samuel. They were twins and were very well behaved. It was always a pleasure spending the night with them. This was around late October on a Friday. Right after my class let out, I went straight over to Mrs. Gruder's place. She and her husband planned on going out of town for a few days, and I was to watch over the twins until their aunt came over on the following day. This worked out well for me, because the boys and I would usually watch TV in the living room until around 8:30, which was when I was to put them to bed. I planned on spending the rest of the night studying for the upcoming mid-semester exam. After I put the boys to bed, I was working on my laptop in the living room, when suddenly, that eerie feeling of being watched came over me. I tried to shake off this feeling, but I became increasingly uncomfortable. It got so bad that I had to get up and look out the back patio door. When I looked out, the only thing I saw was an empty backyard. But something did catch my eye. Towards the fence that separated their yard from the neighbors was one of those old metal swing sets. I remember Mrs. Gruder mentioning at some point that it was left over from the previous owners of the house. There were only two swings on the set, and one of them was rocking back and forth, the way it would if someone had just gotten up from it. When I turned back around, I was nearly startled to death to see that Sam was standing directly behind me. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. After stopping myself from going into cardiac arrest, I asked Sammy what he was doing out of bed. His response made my blood turn to ice. "The woman with no head is keeping me up. Can you please tell her to leave?" I was floored to hear him say that, especially after experiencing that uneasy feeling while I was studying. But my rationality took a hold of me, and I told him that he just had a bad dream. But he asked me to come with him back to his room and stay with him until he fell asleep again. Of course, I obliged him. I adored Sammy, and I would have done anything for him or his brother. When we got back into his bedroom, I was surprised to see that Ash was sitting up in bed. As soon as he saw us, he asked his brother, "Did you tell her about the woman that was in here?" Sam responded, "Yes, but she thinks I was having a bad dream. I didn't know that you saw her too." I was immediately put on edge. If Sammy was just having a nightmare, why did Ashton see the same thing? I tried my best to convince the boys that because they were twins, they shared a special connection, and when one of them would have a bad dream, the other could sometimes feel it too. I didn't believe my own words, but I didn't want to bring up the word ghost because I didn't know how their mother would react to me explaining to them what a ghost was. I decided to stay with the boys and read them a bedtime story until they fell back asleep. Once they were both snoring again, I made my way back into the living room. I immediately noticed that I never closed the blinds above the patio door. As I approached the door, a stranger stepped into view. It was a woman wearing an old-fashioned dress. She appeared to have no color to her. She looked like she came right off the screen of one of those old-timey black and white movies. She did not look like someone who was living in the 21st century. The woman stared daggers at me. I could feel the hatred behind her cold eyes. What happened next is something that I still try to convince myself didn't happen, but my memory is just too vivid for me to be making this up. The woman's head did a 360 and then simply fell off her body. I remember putting one hand over my mouth to stop myself from screaming. The headless apparition remained standing, even after its head fell off. I know that what I'm about to say will make no sense to anyone listening, but I could still feel the woman's cold stare, even though her head was now gone. The image of the headless woman faded from view, and I quickly closed the blinds and made my way back into the boys' bedroom. I slipped under the covers with Sammy and stared at the bedroom door until I eventually passed out. I told no one about what I saw. It wasn't until I got into my car after the boys' aunt came to relieve me that I had a complete nervous breakdown. I never told the Grooters what I experienced because I didn't want to risk them switching babysitters. I cared too much about Ash and Sammy to allow something like this to prevent me from ever seeing them again. I continued to babysit for the Grooters until the twins were old enough to look after themselves. The Grooter house was located in a pretty unremarkable neighborhood. It was about as normal as you could get. Paranormal activity was the last thing I ever expected to experience there. Gainesville has quite the history, so I'm pretty sure there are more than a few restless spirits wandering about. And although I never went through anything like that again, I would still sometimes see one of those old swings rocking back and forth in the dark.
I'm not exactly sure how to start my story. This is probably the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me, and I'm extremely fortunate that I got out without any serious incidents going down. I was in middle school at the time. My name is Angela. I really enjoyed school during those days. I was your typical naive, happy girl. I remember it very vividly. It was my 8th grade first semester, so I had only a few weeks until Christmas vacation, which I was looking forward to because I got to see my cousins. We always had so much fun. My school experiences were pretty ordinary for a girl like me, and I don't want to sound stuck up or anything, but I know that some men considered me attractive, and it became very obvious with the way male teachers behaved towards me and other girls like me. Ask any kid in middle school or high school and they'll tell you, certain male teachers just have a certain feeling about attractive young female students, and one of those teachers for me was Mr. Edwards. I had him for a couple of different classes. He was my homeroom teacher, history teacher, and geography teacher, so I saw him quite a few times every single day. The way he looked at me, it was just a little weird. I didn't recognize it at the time, but the signs were definitely there. He just lingered a little bit too long, and I know I wasn't the only girl in the class that he looked at a little bit too much. Now, for the most part, this was completely harmless. Many of these male teachers never act on their impulses, which is a good thing, but from what I understand, Mr. Edwards was going through specific tribulations in his personal life. I don't really know the specifics, but I heard a rumor that him and his wife got a divorce. I heard that rumor toward the beginning of the semester, which meant that it could have happened sometime in the summer, or maybe even during the school year. I'm not really sure. It was just a rumor. But it certainly would explain some of his behavior. I remember as time went on, my intuition about him became more negative, and I genuinely started feeling uncomfortable in his class. So there was this one time that he called me in front of the class. He would call on students to write the date of a specific event that we were studying, and you would get up and write the date on the board. If you got it right, you got a piece of candy, normally a lollipop or something like that. But if you got it wrong, you just sat back down. We were actually studying World War I, and he called on me to write the date for the start of the war. I wasn't a bad student, but history was really hard for me because I thought it was boring. And I didn't know the date. I just guessed 1904, but apparently that wasn't right. Even now, I still don't care enough to Google it. I finished writing on the board. I turned around to look at Mr. Edwards to see if I had gotten it right or not, and he looked really weird. I'm not even sure how to describe it. Then he said, "You should know this. You've been a very bad girl, Angela. I might have to punish you after class." He was sitting at his desk, and he said it in such a creepy tone of voice. It was the freakiest thing I'd ever seen. I remember looking at everyone's facial expression, and they thought exactly the same thing that I thought. Mr. Edwards caught himself. I guess he realized what a creep he was being and decided to turn the situation into some little joke. He pulled out a Nerf gun from under his desk and shot it at me. The class laughed. It would have been a funny moment had I not felt like he was such a creep just a few seconds prior. I talked to my friends about it after class, and they all agreed that it was really weird. If that experience wasn't bad enough, it got even worse. So it was really cold outside, but the school had the heaters on really high. Everyone, including myself, would wear a really heavy sweater or jacket to school and then take it off when we got inside. It was the only way to do it. It felt like an oven in that school sometimes. Being the forgetful person I am, I left my sweater in class, and it was none other than Mr. Edwards' class. It wasn't a big deal. I had plenty of sweaters and jackets. I even had a spare in my locker that I wore home that day. So it was really easy for me to forget about it after a day or two. I just had other things on my mind. Well, I told my mom about it, and she nagged at me to make sure that I got it before the semester ended. She did the whole, "I buy you all these clothes, you better take care of them" type rant. Kinda typical, but she was right after all. I think it was 2 or 3 days before Christmas break began. I went to Mr. Edwards' class after the last class before the day ended. I was hoping I could just look around and it would be somewhere. Maybe in the back or in the lost and found box, maybe. I looked everywhere, though, and I didn't see it. That was when I asked Mr. Edwards. He was there, and, of course, he was oh so eager to help me find it. When I explained the situation, he acted like he was just remembering something. My mistake. I've just had it under my desk for a few days. I've been meaning to give it to you, I just got caught up with grading final papers." He pulled it out from his drawer in his desk and handed it to me. He played it off like he completely forgot. Something told me that it was not an accident, not only because of what had happened in class that other day, but also by his facial expression when I asked him. I'm guessing that he was holding on to it in hopes of keeping it, and that he hoped that I would just forget about it. Very creepy, I know, and that was one of the creepiest things to ever happen to me, but here's the really crazy part. A couple of years later, I was attending college. I was very fortunate to have found a really good online program for my major, so I was still living in the same town. And I remember learning about the Deviant Offenders database. You know how you can look up any sort of predators that live in your area? It's all publicly available information. I strongly encourage you to check it out. Well, I looked on there for the first time while I was in college, and lo and behold, Mr. Edwards was on there. He was registered there for having relations with a minor. It didn't give you a whole lot of information, but you get a picture of them, all of their information, and what they did. It was a minor and very shocking considering that he abused his power as a teacher. The creepy part is that it happened just a year after I had class with him. I was really grateful he didn't try that with me. I know it's really difficult when someone has so much power and abuses it over you like that, but I looked at some of the other people in that database in my area. I was shocked. It dawned on me that there are many reasons to be very cautious. Stay safe, everyone, and be aware of any predators that live in your area.
I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin. It was Halloween of 2013. I was 16 at the time. Me, my sister Lauren, who was 14, and my brother Jacob, who was 11, were on our own that night. Our mom was taking care of our sick grandmother, and Dad was out of town on business. Trick-or-treating in our neighborhood always ended at around 9 o'clock. Our parents never made us go to school the day after Halloween, so we would usually stay up past our bedtime and watch movies. However, since we were by ourselves and amped up on all the sugar we had consumed, we made other plans. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Wisconsin, but there are a lot of farms here. Our town was pretty much surrounded on all sides by them. In fact, there was a farm just outside our neighborhood, a short walking distance from our house. Every fall, this farm would have an annual pumpkin patch, and we thought it would be fun to go check it out. We didn't plan on vandalizing anything. We just wanted to stroll around and see how creepy the place was in the dark. The pumpkin patch was situated between two large cornfields. About a mile or so behind the patch was the house that the farmer lived in. For the sake of the story, we will call him Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller had always given me the creeps. There was something about him that I could never put my finger on. The only way I can describe it is that he didn't seem to be a real person, if that makes sense. It was like at any moment, his skin would fall off and reveal him to be some kind of alien or something. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, but I'm telling you, there was something off about Mr. Miller. The three of us arrived at the dark, deserted pumpkin patch at around 10 o'clock. There was a series of large sheds between Mr. Miller's house and the patch, so we weren't too worried about being seen. I remember that there was always a couple of scarecrows off in the distance, in the adjacent cornfields. The first thing I noticed when we got there was that there was a third scarecrow that was mounted in the middle of the pumpkin patch. I've been to this patch several times before. Our parents even took us here 2 weeks prior to pick up pumpkins to make into jack-o'-lanterns, and I never remember seeing a scarecrow here before. It usually wouldn't be any cause for alarm. It was Halloween after all, right? However, upon seeing the scarecrow, I instantly had a sinking feeling in my stomach. I looked to either side of me and saw the two usual scarecrows standing in the fields. I figured maybe Mr. Miller wanted to be extra spooky this year. We wandered aimlessly around the pumpkin patch for about 10 minutes. Every so often, I would look to the scarecrow, and I could swear its head would be positioned differently every time I would look at it. It seemed to be watching the three of us as we made our way through the pumpkin patch. I brushed it off as some kind of optical illusion, coupled with the fact that I was in some weirdo's creepy pumpkin patch in the dead of Halloween night. When we approached the scarecrow, Lauren instantly became uneasy. She was seriously creeped out by the figure. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight to get a better look at it. Even from a distance, you could tell that the other scarecrows out in the fields were nothing but straw stuffed into some old clothes. But this one was different. A lot of effort went into its design. It was mounted on a pole in the typical scarecrow stance. It was wearing a dirty pair of overalls, with a red patterned flannel shirt underneath. Its head was a burlap sack, with a jack-o'-lantern face stitched onto it, and it was wearing a black conical hat with a pair of matching black boots. As my phone's dim light passed over its surface, I noticed these dark red stains on the overalls. As I was examining the straw man, Jacob, being the little shit he was, came between me and Lauren. "I bet you're too chicken to take off its mask." Me, never passing up a chance to show up my little brother, accepted the dare, on the condition that he would have to forfeit all of the Reese's cups that he had gathered that night. After Jacob agreed to those terms, I had Lauren hold my phone's light on the scarecrow while I made my way towards it. As I got closer, the sinking feeling I mentioned earlier became stronger. However, my desire for those delicious peanut butter cups and the satisfaction I would get eating them in front of Jacob overpowered my fear. Now only inches away from it, I slowly reached for the burlap sack. That's when the unthinkable happened. One of the scarecrow's arms shot forth, and a gloved hand grabbed my wrist. The first thing I heard was Lauren screaming as the flashlight vanished. The next thing I heard was my two siblings taking off on foot, leaving me for dead. I tried pulling away, but the scarecrow's grip was too tight. I yanked and yanked, but it was no use. I then looked up in absolute horror to see that the scarecrow was now leaning forward on its pole and was now looking at me dead in the eye. I was like a deer in the headlights. I stopped struggling and just stared back at the stitched-on grinning face. A muffled voice then came from beneath the burlap sack, and what was said really caught me off guard. "Happy Halloween." And with that, the scarecrow let go. I never ran so fast before in my life. I hauled ass out of there and back towards my neighborhood. I met Lauren and Jacob outside the entrance to our neighborhood. They were relieved to see that I was still alive. I'm glad I got to them before one of them called our mother, because we all would have been in some deep shit if she found out that we went to the pumpkin patch after dark. After giving them both a harsh scolding for ditching me, we walked home. Even now, it still baffles me to no end that someone would be out there in a dark, deserted pumpkin patch long after it closed, dressed up as a scarecrow, just waiting for someone to come along. I don't know if it was Mr. Miller or one of his farmhands, but when my parents offered to take us there the following year, all three of us promptly turned them down. I may have gotten the daylight scared out of me that night. However, I did enjoy eating all of Jacob's Reese's cups the following day.
Principal of an elementary school. He was in his late 20s, early 30s at the time, and despite being young, he was a born leader. He was a great principal and everyone loved him. I can attest to that as I attended multiple award ceremonies for him, and the respect and admiration he received was crazy. There was a young boy at the school who was having behavioral issues in class, and my grandfather saw that the kid didn't have a lot of parental support. So he called in his father and had talked with him about spending more time with his son and just a general parenting session. It turned out that all the boy needed was his dad's attention, and after a few weeks, he was a happy model student. Whenever my grandfather would leave school late, he would see the dad was playing basketball with his son after he got home from work. It was one of those moments that he took pride in, being able to make a difference in people's lives. However, not everything had such an easy solution, and my grandfather found himself having to deal with an employee, Stanley the janitor, who was showing up to work drunk. Stanley was an alcoholic with a mean streak, and my grandfather tried on multiple occasions to deal with his behavior. Finally, one day Stanley showed up so drunk that my grandfather sent him home and called the superintendent to let him know he was going to be firing him the next morning after he sobered up. He then warned them to let him deal with it when Stanley was sober, because he was not a stable person. As it goes in these kinds of stories, the superintendent was furious and decided that he was going to call Stanley himself and fire him despite my grandfather's warning. No one called my grandfather to tell him about it either, so he was completely in the dark and thought he could deal with it in the morning. Stanley was furious and went to the school that evening. He searched the offices, my grandfather's included, and tore things apart until he finally had what he wanted. He was in a blaze of fury, and on his way out, he saw the father and his son playing basketball. He walked towards them and pulled something out of his trousers. It was a gun. He then proceeded to shoot the little boy, killing him instantly. The father was so upset, was hysterically crying, but somehow managed to get the gun away from Stanley and shoot him. My grandfather was called to the elementary school immediately by the police because there were 2 dead bodies. The little boy and Stanley were dead. What was even worse was the crying from the father and him saying that he couldn't save his son. It was clear that he could never forgive himself for that day. My grandfather was pulled aside by one of the police who had searched Stanley for evidence. They had found a list, a hit list of people that he was going to kill, and all the addresses of those people that he had retrieved when he searched the offices. My grandfather was number 1 on that list. So, if it weren't for that father, it's likely that I would never been able to meet my grandfather, and possibly my mother and grandmother would have been killed if Stanley had been able to complete his mission. To this day, I get goosebumps whenever I hear that story, and it's just so chilling. My grandfather never uttered a single word about this after his initial recount, and my mother made me swear to never tell him I knew. He carried the weight of that boy's death on him until the day he died. We were visiting a friend's house. After a couple of hours, my mom and my friend's mom asked us to go fetch something from my house. So we go back to my home, which is a long way from his, and the walk seemed uncomfortably long and creepy and had an eerie atmosphere for some reason. After ages of walking, we reach my house and we get the thing they needed, which was inside the house. So I unlocked the door and got the object, and I noticed the bathroom door was lit and the exhaust fan was on, which we usually turn off unless someone is using the toilet. But I didn't give that any attention and thought my dad was using the toilet since he wasn't in my friend's house when we left. So me and my buddy decided to wait outside the house for my dad to finish, and I occasionally went to the small window outside the bathroom and called for my dad, but I didn't get an answer. But I heard someone humming and singing, so I thought that he was having a good time. After a good half an hour passed, I started feeling uneasy and told my friend we had to leave because our parents are probably angry now. When we arrived at his house, we were shocked to see my dad sitting and talking to my friend's parents. We asked him, "Where were you?" And he said, "I didn't go anywhere. I just stayed here since we first came." This made me scared because my family had been here for 3 hours, and we just waited for my dad for 1 hour. I go ask my sister the same question and get the same response. Someone was surely in my bathroom. After the visit is done, we go back home just to find the front door, which I locked and unlocked, and the bathroom door was wide open. My family acted normally, but I was completely freaking out, and I couldn't get any sleep that night. It wasn't the last time I babysat, back when I was 16 in the early 80s. I'd just gotten a driver's license and needed gas and insurance money for the old beat-up car I'd bought. I was watching 2 boys, about 6 and 10, while parents went out to celebrate some anniversary or something. They had promised to be home at 11. At the time, cell phones were pretty rare, so no way to contact them other than calling the restaurant. Evening was going great until about 9:30 when their large, aggressive Doberman goes crazy running around the house barking and growling before running into the basement, refusing to come up. Sort of freaks me out a bit because this dog is huge, aggressive, and very protective of the house and kids. I do a quick check of the house and kids and everyone was okay. I let the dog stay in the basement, put kids to bed at around 10 as instructed by the parents. Job done. So I'm watching TV at around 10:30 when suddenly I begin to smell something burning. Running into the youngest boy's room and find the oldest boy in bed with him. Both are asleep, so I wake them both and tell them that we need to get the dog and go outside. But the dog just straight up refuses to leave the basement. And I had to prioritize. So I get the kids outside and tell them to sit in the front yard while I go in to call the fire department. Not showing good judgment here, but I was 16. Oldest says, "I left a candle burning under my bed." As I go back in, Yup, a candle under their bed, since apparently monsters couldn't live anywhere where there's light. I know, dumb kids. As I open the door to go back in, there's this huge explosion behind me across the street and power goes out. The kids start screaming and follow me back into the house. I grab the phone, but there's no dial tone. I get the kids out of the house again, onto the back porch this time, and make it really clear that they're to stay there, but I can still hear the dog whimpering in the basement. I run to the oldest kid's bedroom with the fire extinguisher and flashlight from the kitchen and look under the bed through hazy smoke. The offending candle has gone out, but has burnt a hole in the box spring, which also has gone out. I flip the box spring and blast it with the extinguisher just in case. I then run to the front porch to see the transformer on a telephone pole had exploded. A lightning pole... What? Lighting the pole on fire and taking out the phone and electricity service for the street. I run and check on the box springs, which are still out. I open the bedroom windows to air out the room, then get the kids off the back porch into the living room onto the couch, where they both are just crying their eyes out. The oldest was apologizing for the fire, but insisted that if he didn't keep the candle lit, then, of course, monsters would get him. Fire department shows up for the transformer at around 11. Kids fall asleep on the couch at around midnight after watching the firemen across the street put out the transformer fire, and the power comes back on at about 1:30 a.m. The parents show up at 2:30 a.m. when they were supposed to be back by 11. They're somewhat buzzed and start complaining that the kids are not in bed and the oldest room is trashed with a flipped-over mattress and dry fire extinguisher powder covering the box springs. And to add insult to injury, they straight up refuse to pay me. The situation gets really tense, and would you believe it? The Doberman picks this time to come out of the basement and starts aggressively growling at me. Walked out with $1 to my name, and I never babysat again. My name is Jamila, and I'm a medical student at Barts, a medical and dental school here at Queen Mary's University in London. I want to specialize and become a consultant in obstetrics and gynecology, and that requires a very particular area of study, but for almost every medical student in the UK, the first year of study is pretty much the same. And one of the things we all do at some point during that first year is something called prosection. Prosection is sort of like dissection in that you're dealing with dead bodies and stuff, only instead of dissection, where you're chopping up an entire body, prosection is when the dead body has already been chopped up by an experienced anatomist so that medical students can study its anatomical structure. About 3 times a year, we'll put on our white coats, along with a pair of goggles and latex gloves, and then we'll head down into the basement where all the cadavers are kept, and study specific parts that are laid out on those big metal tables. This is basically like a circuit of looking at each organ or body part for about 10 minutes before moving on to the next. It's definitely one of the grimmer things we do during the first year of medical school, and if you've even got an ounce of squeamishness in you, 1 or 2 prosection sessions are enough to squash that out of you. So a couple of days after my second prosection session first year, I received a generic email from a department head stating that all prosections would be canceled for the foreseeable future. I didn't really take much notice of it. My next session probably wasn't going to be for another few months, so I figured it wouldn't apply to me. But that wasn't exactly the case, because a few days after I got the email, I got a knock on my room in the halls of residence, and when I opened it up, there was a female police officer stood in the threshold. She very politely explained that the halls of residence had given the Met Police permission to search my room, but she wanted to be polite and asked if I minded if a few other officers called by in the next half hour or so to have a little look around my room. Obviously, I had nothing to hide, and my room was like the size of a cupboard, so of course I consented. She thanked me and moved on, before 2 other officers called by a short while later, only this pair had a sniffer dog with them. Like I said, I had absolutely nothing to hide, so I just stood there politely while the officers ran the dog around the small interior of my room. It had a little sniff around, for like 10 seconds tops, then they too thanked me for my cooperation and then moved on, but not before I asked them if they could tell me what was going on. One of the officers apologized and told me they weren't allowed to talk about it, but They were sure the university would mention something to us soon enough. Only they didn't. Weeks went by, and we were pretty much left to just assume that since there was a sniffer dog involved, that the whole police search was because someone in the halls was suspected of drug dealing, or at least having drugs in their room. Students and drugs go together like a horse and carriage, so assuming it was something drug-related, it seemed perfectly logical. But we were wrong, because the real reason the rooms were searched was far darker, and considerably more disturbing than just a few bags of weed or something. Now, I can't actually confirm this, and I don't have any solid evidence for what were essentially rumors that went around, but someone apparently high up in the anatomy department went off the record and told a student that the cancellations of the prosection sessions and the sniffer dog search were linked. Apparently, someone had stolen a specimen from the basement during the session I was in. It was something that had happened once or twice over the years. Someone had pilfered a preserved heart or a skull, but in this case, an entire head had gone missing from the basement, and the potential for scandal was phenomenal. None of this ever ended up in the papers or in the news, so many of it was just rumors that couldn't be confirmed. But I also heard that Bartz was forced to make a huge out-of-court settlement with someone that same year, and that a non-disclosure agreement and high court injunction had been put in place. Honestly, that could have been over literally anything, student misconduct or some other kind of scandal, yet I can't help but connect the dots from the rumors and the search to the payout and the injunction. I really do think someone stole a human head from the basement somehow, but whether or not it was a student or a member of staff, I'm not sure. And why ever anyone would want to do that is just beyond me. I'm really not sure I want to know why someone would want to steal a preserved head from an anatomy lab, or what they'd do with it once they did. It's also pretty frightening that Bartz seemed more concerned in covering things up and sweeping things under the rug than really getting to the bottom of what happened, or keeping us informed. I'd considered doing more digging if the whole thing didn't leave such a bad taste in my mouth, and like I said, the whole thing raises questions that, if I'm honest, I'm not sure I really want to know the answers to. And so I just have to live with it. Live with the fact that one of my fellow students could have stolen a human head, hid it away somewhere, and are now using it for some truly sickening, perverse things. Okay, so little side note here. Has anyone else noticed how nice the weather has gotten since the lockdown started? God, it's been so frustrating. Shut indoors while the weather went from gray and windy to warm and sunny like, well, must have been a matter of days. In all my life, I've honestly never seen spring slam into winter with such a dramatic transition. It's been tough on my little girl, too. She's been dying to get out to the local park to play on the jungle gyms, and telling her no, not to mention explaining why, has been harder and harder as the weeks have gone by. I can't tell her the truth because I know it would absolutely terrify her. Breaking down, there are little creatures living inside of us, waiting to be transmitted to someone she loves like Pap or Nana, which could end their lives. How do you even say that to a child without them totally freaking out? So, our story starts with bird watching. I know, boring, but try telling that to my daughter. She burned through all her DVDs and favorite YouTube channels in like a week, and despite some of them having palpable rewatch value to them, she quickly grew tired of staring at a screen for hours on end. It got way worse, and we started having to tell her no about going to the park. Seems like once you hold something out of reach of a kid, it's all they want from then on, the forbidden thing. I found a happy compromise with her, in that if she stayed inside, she could look at the garden all she wanted. And the bonus was that if she stayed super still and quiet, that all kinds of birds and other critters would wander into the garden for her to look at. And you know what? It actually got kind of fun after a while. I actually fished out an old native birds of the upper American East Coast that I'm pretty sure was my grandpa's at one point, and we got to work ticking off each one we saw. Working our way through the book as common and rarely seen birds alike landed among the flower beds of our backyard. One evening, I'd swear I saw something larger moving around the trees at the back of our yard, but I figured it was just a trick of the light, maybe a neighbor's dog moving against their back fence, casting shadows into ours. But a few days later, I discovered it wasn't just my imagination. I was doing some laundry upstairs while my daughter busied herself with bird watching. I'd ordered a cheap pair of kids' binoculars from Amazon, and those things really had paid for themselves by the evening of the day they arrived. My kid was obsessed with them. She had them practically strapped to her face for the entire day, looking at everything and anything up close and being amazed at the results. So she was only happy to sit in front of the patio window doors and while away the hours by checking out the wildlife at close range through her new binos. And thank God, because having to keep an eye on her day in and day out was meaning housework was mounting up, and at the top of the list was laundry. So I'm working through piles of dirty clothes, calling down to her every so often to see how she was doing, and everything seems to be going fine. Every so often I'd rush down when she claimed to have spotted a new kind of bird in our garden. Often I'd have to point out that it was one we'd seen before, but once or twice we actually locked eyes with a lesser spotted woodpecker, a bird we most definitely hadn't spotted before. Only when I heard her cry out, "Kitty," I figured she must have gotten kind of bored of watching for birds. At first I was a little worried. The last thing I wanted was for my little girl to witness a full-on bird murder in our own backyard, but I was quietly reassured by the fact that all the neighborhood cats were fat and spoiled and they wouldn't be finessing at backyard birds anytime soon. That was for certain. Suddenly I heard a kind of thump against the window doors, like my daughter had hit her hand against the glass super hard. I called down to tell her not to hit the glass as it would scare all the birds away and they might not come back to visit. Her answer made me drop the laundry basket and hurtle downstairs. "I didn't. It was the kitty." But that thump was loud, bigger and louder than anything a simple house cat could make. It was so weird to write back now, but I distinctly remember just not thinking at all, just sort of flying into action, this white-hot urge to protect, just turning me into more machine than woman. And what do I see the moment I turn the corner into the living room? I see my daughter, standing at the glass doors, staring at an actual mountain lion in the face. The huge cat had its paw half cocked, as if I didn't already have an idea that it was the one making that banging noise against the glass. I ran toward my little girl with such speed and aggression that the mountain lion jumped back for a second. The inherent danger of the situation, danger that she seemed to be completely unaware of previously, caught up with her and hit her like a freight train. She started bawling, screaming, realizing in a white-hot moment that Kitty didn't want to play. Kitty wanted to rip and tear. That the kitty wasn't a kitty at all. Once it realized I'd taken away its intended prey, the mountain lion took a few more swipes at the glass and only rushed out the backyard once I started banging pots and pans together real loud, just like my grandpa had showed me years before. I guess this was just a long-winded way of saying to keep a real close eye on the woods and green spaces when this lockdown is over. It might not be entirely safe for our kids to be playing in places that have obviously been reclaimed by wildlife, and dangerous wildlife at that. My neighbor Gary has lived across the street from our house ever since we moved in. He's a nice guy, like perennially nice. Never has a bad word to say about anyone, always sees the best in people. He never fails to see things in a positive light and has been a welcome fixture at every barbecue or block party we've ever thrown. But this latest crisis has been pretty hard on Gary and his family, and over the past few weeks I've noticed some pretty disturbing changes in his behavior. Changes that have meant that Gary went from being the Ned Flanders personality clone we love so much to being someone that I'm quite frankly terrified of. I remember when we first heard rumors of a lockdown coming, Gary came over to talk about it. He was his usual jolly self, laughing off the scaremongering coming from the media. But as we talked about a shortage on food and hand sanitizer becoming a reality, he grew unsettled in a way I'd never really seen before. Gary has 2 young kids, but he also has his elderly mother living with him. He once told me he just didn't have the heart to put her in a home, how that seemed way too much like abandonment. Gary was just that kind of guy. At least he was that kind of guy. I only really started noticing the change when he came home one day with a trunk loaded with groceries. Not just the trunk either. The back seat of his SUV was overloaded with paper grocery bags. Some were loaded with meat and vegetables, some stacked entirely full of canned goods. But it was the box full of hand sanitizer that really made me take notice. Gary was the polar opposite of a germaphobe. Like, polar opposite. He routinely ignored the 5-second rule when it came to barbecue items dropped into lawn grass, and was very much of the opinion that letting kids play outside, letting them eat a little dirt from time to time, was just good for their immune system. It'd make them tough in a way that playing with screens just wouldn't. We actually used to laugh at people who kept those little Purell bottles in hip holsters, overly paranoid losers who would drive their cars off a bridge if they really knew how many microorganisms lived in their eyelashes alone. But here Gary was, unloading an entire pallet of hand sanitizer from his truck. "Got some to spare, huh, buddy?" I shouted over from my porch. "Not at the prices I just paid," he replied. Seems innocuous, I know, but if you knew Gary, you'd be just as interested to note that this reply didn't come with a smile or a chuckle. He barely even looked at me as he took the supplies inside. But things only really took a turn for the worse when one of Gary's kids took a tumble while playing in the street outside their house. They were playing on the new bike, riding around in circles, when I guess they just lost their balance and fell hard onto the concrete. You could tell it was a bad fall from the way they let out this pained, shocked cry before bursting into tears. My wife was out on the porch at the time, sipping an iced tea, and saw the whole thing. I had heard the scream, but wasn't sure what happened until I saw my wife grabbing the first aid kit we keep in a kitchen cabinet. I followed her outside into the street, but as she approached Gary's kid, the man himself was stood in his front doorway. In the sternest voice I'd ever heard out of the man, he told my wife to get away from his kid. I guess she understood what he meant. As she stopped just short of the crying child, took a few steps back, and then slid the first aid kit across the concrete in her direction. Gary's other kid was old enough to know what that first aid kit was, but as he tried to pick it up off the ground, Gary erupted at him to not touch that frickin' thing and to get back inside the house. My wife apologized for her hastiness, but assured Gary she had the best of intentions. And for the first time in 4 or 5 years since we'd moved into the neighborhood, I actually found myself getting angry with him. He didn't even acknowledge my wife's apology, giving us both a contemptuous look as he closed and locked the front door behind him. A few days later, we saw the same kid who fell wearing a makeshift sling and looked pretty miserable. It took us a while to put 2 and 2 together, but we did, and we realized that Gary hadn't, nor had any intention of taking his kid to the hospital to get their arm looked at by a doctor. It was only then did it really hit me just how bad this whole pandemic thing was affecting him. He wasn't just taking precautions, as the rest of us were. He seemed to be going full-on survivalist, like the guy's entire personality had shifted over what was apparently just the course of a week or so. It was disconcerting, to say the least. Then, just a few nights ago, my wife shook me awake to tell me she could smell something burning. I literally fell out of bed thinking she was telling me our house was on fire, but she assured me it wasn't, and that she could just smell something. As my senses came to life, I began to be able to smell it too, this acrid, smoky smell that was obviously something being burned. It only took me one look out of our bedroom window to tell me where it was coming from, an orange glow emanating from across the street. There was a fire in Gary's backyard. The smell wasn't just bothering us either. Almost every bedroom light of every house in the block was switched on, and I could see some similarly irritated neighbors floating by their windows, trying to find out where the stench was coming from. I decided to just suck it up, go over, and ask him to put the fire out. God knows what he was burning, but I knew from the smell that it wasn't healthy. But no sooner had I crossed onto Gary's half of the street, he appears from his backyard gate. At least I figured it was Gary. I couldn't see his face. It was covered up with one of those old Gulf War-era gas masks, the kind with the big round glass eyes that made him look more simian than human. That, along with the 12-gauge shotgun that he had firmly in his grip, sent a shiver of fear running through me. "Get away from my house, Martin!" His words were muffled by the mask, but it was clear what he said. "Gary, buddy, that fire's—" "Get away from my house, Martin!" He never called me Martin, always Marty. It was the first time I'd ever heard him call me by my actual name. I just did the smart thing. I backed off, hands raised, slow enough to keep him from freaking out and shooting me dead right there in the street. I haven't talked to or seen Gary for the past few days, and I'm more than willing to give him the space he and his family need, if that's what it takes for him to stay sane. But please, if any of your neighbors are suffering right now, please reach out to see if they're okay, if they need anything at all, even if it is just for you to keep your distance. I'm sure Gary will be fine in time when all of this stuff is calmed down. I hope he returns to be the man I once knew and loved. Have y'all been following all these Zoom and Skype dates that have been happening since the lockdown started? As you imagine, the use of dating apps have skyrocketed since the government had ordered us all inside for the foreseeable future. Those who would usually flaunt their game in the club or at the gym are now forced to use the same tactics as the less socially adept of us in dating apps. And although I'm not entirely happy with the increased competition, I'd be lying if I said my match count hasn't bumped up a little. Silver linings, right? Anyway, instead of using Tinder or Hinge, with their increased emphasis on physical appearances, definitely not my strong point given I'm about 30 pounds overweight right now, I opted for Reddit's R4R forum, which is full of posts from those who want to hook up for conversation, flirting, and occasionally even more. So, I put up this pretty dumb post, basically asking if there were any girls that wanted to have like a lockdown date or whatever. I listed a bunch of my interests, mainly horror movies and a few political issues close to my heart, and implored anyone who identified with them to get in touch. One or two girls did, and I feel mean admitting this, but they just didn't seem particularly engaging. Nice, yes, charming, one really was, but our talks didn't light a fire in me. Not like the message I got in the wee small hours of the morning when I was up way past my usual bedtime. The message from a girl named Amber who wrote eloquently and charmingly about how she too was looking for something of a lockdown bae herself. She was highly politically involved, as she put it, which definitely sparked my interest, in sharp comparison with the two other girls who wrote back to me who didn't seem interested in politics. She was also extremely intelligent. The way she was able to articulate her thoughts was something I had rarely encountered in online interactions, which is also why I was so shocked when I found out she was only 18, 11 years my junior. Only, when she described herself, I started to get suspicious. She seemed perfect. Too perfect. She told me she was 5'7", Asian American, fit, and toned from yoga and spin class. In her own words, she was pretty cute. Catfish was the first thought that came to my mind. There was absolutely no way a girl as cute-sounding as that would be getting in contact with me, so I just made a joke about it. Well, a joke that wasn't really a joke. I basically called her out on it. How she didn't have to pretend to be some hot Asian girl just to get my attention, not with the kind of conversational skills that she did. The next message was just a link to an Imgur photo. A risky click, if ever there was one, as there was absolutely nothing in the way of a caption to clue me into what the picture was of. But I suppose curiosity just got the better of me, and I just clicked. For those that don't already know, a verification photo is when a person handwrites their username or other pertinent information on a piece of paper to prove that they are indeed who they say they are. And yep, you guessed it, The picture was verification. As it turned out, Amber was exactly who she claimed to be. Young, Asian, and impossibly gorgeous. I mean, I was literally stunned when I saw that picture of her. I just stopped and stared for what seemed like minutes. When it came to returning the favor, I was terrified. I am not in the least bit confident about my appearance, as I've made clear, and the idea of trying to take a selfie, something I'd never even done before that evening, was almost too much to bear. But I did it anyway. I combed my hair, washed my face, then went over my beard with the barely used trimmer my mom bought me for my 28th birthday. Basically her way of telling me to get that stuff off my face. Then, when I was done, I found my angle, took the photo, and then sent it over. The suspense, the raw suspense, oh my god. I honestly think the last time I was that nervous was before my first date I ever went on as a 17-year-old in high school. I'm talking that heart-racing, sweaty palm, time-slowing down nervous that makes you feel sick to your stomach. I was convinced I'd never hear from her again, that she'd see how mismatched this whole thing was and just up and ghost me. Only she didn't. She actually replied saying that I was cute. That was 3 weeks ago now. We've talked every single day since then, sometimes having multiple hour-long phone calls that run into the wee small hours of the morning. And the more we talked, the more serious things became. At one point, Amber asked where she saw this going after lockdown was over. She told me she was living in Portland, whereas I was all the way over in the greater Boston area, pretty much opposite ends of the country to one another. But she pretty much straight up raised the issue of us needing to act on the chemistry we had. I told her that money was no object, that she was legit the most beautiful, charming young woman I'd ever met in my entire life. It was true. I meant every word of it, but I understood when she told me that she heard that kind of thing all the time, that they'd tell her just about anything to get the chance to sleep with her. And I believed that too. She asked me how far I'd be willing to go to prove myself to her. I told her as far as she needed me to go. At that, she just laughed, telling me how she doubted it. I was indignant. I'd do anything, everything she asked just to make her believe it. That's when she told me to get a knife. I'm ashamed to say that there was barely any hesitation. I just trusted her. I trusted that she knew what was best for me. She already seemed to be able to read me like a book. She asked if I had an envelope handy. I told her yes, that I had a pack of about 100 crisp white envelopes. She told me to open it. I obeyed. She told me to place the blade of the knife onto my palm. I obeyed. And when she finally gave me the order, I pulled the blade across my flesh and let fresh blood flow onto the open envelope. It didn't even hurt. It was the strangest thing, but for the first few minutes there was no pain at all. Just this dull, hot feeling as I watched the blood flow from the open wound, staining the perfect white of the paper a deep crimson. I held everything up to the webcam, showing her exactly how far I was willing to go for her. And oh my God, the look on her face, the way her pretty almond eyes seemed to light up, it just filled me with joy. I don't really know why I'm telling you this. I know it's making me sound crazy just as much as it's making her sound toxic. But in that moment, it all just made so much sense. Words are cheap, actions count for something, and there's no dearer currency than our own lifeblood. It seemed like the purest act of devotion imaginable, and for a while, I saw nothing wrong with it and had zero regrets. When it was done, she told me to buy a larger plastic envelope, one that'll properly conceal the blood-filled paper one. Then I was to mail it to her. Again, it made a lot of sense. It was possible to fake something like that, pretty easily, so the idea that she wanted to see for herself, to verify that I'd be true to her, it was just second nature. As instructed, I paid extra for next-day delivery, a lot extra, but it would be worth it. It felt like every penny I spent on this girl was worth it. Money can't buy something like we shared, at least. That's the way it felt at the time. I remember being so excited at the prospect of her opening that envelope, of seeing her satisfaction at knowing what I'd done for her. And when she showed me her opening that thing over webcam, it was every bit as disgustingly glorious as I imagined. Her eyes lit up in that same adorable way, and she smiled in a way I'd never quite seen before. Such a wide, white smile. She giggled as she held it up, bringing a hand to her mouth, and in one fluid motion, she brought the blood-stained envelope to her lips and kissed it. Only, she didn't just kiss it. I watched transfixed as she began to lick at the dried bloodstains, spitting on them and lathering them with her tongue until the dried mess hydrated and formed a sticky crimson residue. Now, writing this now, it's really obviously disgusting, but at the time, it seemed like love. It was the purest act of acceptance of another living being I'd ever witnessed. She was purporting to adore the very blood that ran through my veins, that even in a dried-up, crusty state, she could invigorate it. It said so much with so little. The next day, we got into a conversation about cats. Amber loved kitties, as she put it. She had a bunch of clothes with cat designs on them, hair accessories that resembled cat girls. It was a whole theme for her. But since she was in college, living in a dorm room that she was basically trapped in due to lockdown, there was no way of her getting to own one. Now, for the first time being away, I confess that since my last girlfriend had broken up with me and moved out, I'd strongly been considering getting a pet to combat the crushing loneliness that came with a lifestyle such as mine. This revelation delighted her, and she asked if I would go get her one. I was confused at first, thinking we meant she wanted me to, send her a cat. I didn't think this was entirely out of the question. I mean, animal shelters would still need to run despite the COVID thing. There had to be a way I could find an animal shelter in her area and arrange to have one dropped off. But obviously that's not what she meant at all. She wanted me to get a cat. I acquiesced to the idea pretty quickly. It did suit my plans after all. But then the conversation took a weird turn. She asked me if I loved kitties, so I told her yes. The truth is, I don't like them as much as dogs, but I wasn't about to overcomplicate the situation by saying that. Then she asked me which I liked more, her or cats. Again, I said her. Then she asked if I loved enough to hurt something innocent. I hesitated, but again I said yes. Then came those fatal words that now don't seem so loving anymore. Prove it, she told me, in no uncertain terms, that she wanted me to prove that I loved her more than any other living creature. She didn't want me to get into any trouble, to ruin my career by getting a criminal record or anything, but she still wanted proof. It was horrifying, listening to her talk. She had obviously thought this out, maybe even long in advance. She told me I could get a really old cat from a rescue center, one that was near the end of its life anyway, one that might well be suffering from joint pain or breathing trouble. She told me to look at it like an act of mercy, one that would prove I was the right man for her, one that could make difficult decisions and own them too. And I'm ashamed to admit, I agreed to every word. I found that local animal shelters in my area were still indeed operating. I called one to ask them a few questions regarding the adoption process and found it would be infinitely easier than I even expected. I could pay them a visit and leave with the cat the very same day. Then it came to asking my own rather tailored set of questions. I told her I wanted to give an older kitty a comfortable time in its twilight years, that I was something of a feline philanthropist and had been doing so for many years. It was heart-wrenching, hearing that rescue center worker telling me what a good person I was, how no one wanted to adopt the older cats, and how one would be so happy to have finally found someone to take care of them. I think that's what did it. The sobering moment that made me realize how stupid I'd been these past few weeks. How lust and desire and loneliness had driven me to the point where I was willing to relinquish my entire humanity. I had never heard so much as a fly in my entire life, and there I was, planning to hurt an innocent, essentially defenseless animal. I knew I had to do something. I opted for a clean break. I thought about writing her a long goodbye message, explaining how I'd come to that decision, hoping it wouldn't hurt her feelings too much, but then it occurred to me that she didn't really have feelings, not like you or I might do. She had a fixation on what she could do. It all made sense in that context. She got off on power, on manipulation, and any way she could achieve that was justified. I blocked her on Discord, deleted the email account I'd used to send her long stream of consciousness letters from. It hurt. It hurt really, really bad at first, but once I told myself she'd easily find a new partner, a new victim, the decisions became much, much easier to deal with. So please, people, learn from my stupid, short-sighted mistakes. Don't let this lockdown loneliness get the better of you, because there are people out there, bad people, just waiting to exploit it. I live here in New Zealand, and late in 2018, I was feeling sort of lonely, so I decided to download the dating app Tinder to try and find myself a nice guy to go on a few dates with, maybe even find myself a long-term boyfriend out of it. I ended up matching with this guy who'd come over from Australia, and we chatted for 2 weeks before we finally met up. The conversation was quite light, nothing too heavy, and it was fun. Like I said, it was from Australia, so we talked about Aussie things, and I remember telling him how much I wanted to visit Melbourne. He said that he'd been there once or twice and started making recommendations for some great coffee shops that he knew of. He seemed like a nice, normal guy, and when we agreed to meet, I was happy to do that. But then maybe 5 days or so before we were due to meet, he got really persistent and impatient. He would text me multiple times in a day, and if I didn't reply straight away, he would ask if something was wrong. And I thought it was weird that he was being so clingy after starting off so confident. He kept trying to bring the date forward so we could meet up sooner, and would totally forget if I had told him I was busy on a particular day, almost like he wasn't paying attention or didn't care about what I had to say. It was honestly really unusual for someone to be that persistent with me. I've had guys before who are maybe a bit persistent, but only out of a nervous excitement, a different kind of excited than this Aussie guy seemed to be. I just couldn't understand why it was that he could not possibly wait until the Sunday that we'd arranged to meet. It felt very narcissistic, and I should have seen it as the red flag that it was, and just not met up with him at all. I had the messages saved on my phone for a while, so I have a record of the exact dates and times that he sent some of his messages. So on the 2nd of December, he messaged me just after 9 a.m. saying, "Good morning, how is you?" And again about an hour and a half later. I didn't reply to the first message because I was asleep, and I think he took it the wrong way because he said it was fine if I'd changed my mind and didn't feel like going on the date. That was when I messaged him back and confirmed that I would meet him later on that day. We met up and went to a place called Revelry. It's a very standard bar, very popular, and lots of people go there, but it's definitely more of a nighttime bar. I had never drunk there during the afternoon or the daytime, but it was open, seemed like it had a chill atmosphere, and he wanted to go there, so that's where we went. He was a bit bigger than the pictures on his Tinder profile showed, and it was obvious that he had put on a little bit of weight. He had big, distinctive eyes, and he was very, very clean-cut. I mean, like his clothes looked freshly washed and ironed. He was also very well-groomed, obviously took good care of his skin and stuff like that, like he was really good-looking. I remember asking him a lot of different questions, and he just sort of talked at me. He tried to ask me a few questions, but they weren't very in-depth ones. I thought he was a bit nervous, to be honest, but that's not unusual for a first date. But things started to sort of unravel at one point because he had said one thing in messages about where he worked and a different thing on the date. I started to feel a bit uneasy, like I wanted to trust him, but as soon as he started to put on some inconsistencies, I began to wonder if he was just lying about stuff to impress me. Because he was from Australia, I asked him the whereabouts that he had met his Kiwi friends, and he told me that all of his friends were police officers or somehow involved in law enforcement. He said how he had met with them while out drinking in various bars, how they gotten to know each other over time, and they regularly invited him back to their places for barbecues and stuff like that. He also mentioned that his best friend from Australia was coming over to be a Crown Court prosecutor. That's when I noticed that a lot of the stuff that he was talking about kind of had this running theme to it. It kind of seemed like he was obsessed with that sort of thing, which, in hindsight, explains an awful lot. I think he was sort of trying to process some of the things that he had been up to over the previous few days, and it came out in his conversation style. He obviously thought an awful lot about policemen, dead bodies, and ways people can be killed, prosecution, justice, and the court system, and it just came out in a very strange way like that on our first date. Like I said before, we talked quite a lot about him being friends with lots of different policemen, and he went into quite a bit of depths regarding the details of certain investigations that they'd apparently shared with him. He said they were having a really tough time around that time because of bodies going missing in the Waitakere Ranges. He told me that police corpse-sniffing dogs can only detect decaying flesh about 4 feet deep under the soil, so if the bodies are buried any deeper than that, the police won't be able to find them. I thought it was a bit of a morbid thing to talk about on a first date, but it was an interesting fact nonetheless. We also got into a conversation about all the different kinds of poisonous snakes in Australia, and he became quite animated about that. He obviously had a passion for the natural world. It was quite out there, but I thought it was cute. I love animals too, so I was glad we had something in common, and it made me feel a bit more relaxed again. But then, right as I started feeling comfortable with him again, he started telling me this really bizarre and creepy story. He told me how crazy it is that a guy can make one little mistake and then go to jail for the rest of his life for it. He went on to tell me about this guy he knew back in Oz who had consensual intimacy involving choking with his girlfriend and had ended up accidentally killing her in the process. He assured me that the whole thing was a horrible, tragic accident, how things just went wrong suddenly and how the guy was really upset because he loved her and would never hurt her on purpose. But still, the guy got done for manslaughter and was sent to prison for a long, long time. What I know now is this could have been him testing out his story on me. When he was able to see that I was a bit uncomfortable with what he was saying, he tried to change the subject so we could talk about more mundane things. I didn't try to make a swift exit or anything. I am quite used to dealing with all sorts of people, and I'm not saying people who talk about dark things on a first date are like bad people or anything, but it was definitely weird. We hung out for a while, but after about 3 hours or so, I made some excuse as to why I had to leave, and we said goodbye. As we were parting ways, he said, "My car is this way," and pointed off down a particular road. My car was down that same road, but by that stage, I was feeling uneasy and my instincts had just kicked in, telling me to walk a different way. He was also a lot bigger than me, so if something went wrong, I knew I wouldn't be able to defend myself. In hindsight, it was a good decision. It was my intuition sense. My brain was saying, this was strange, that was strange. And looking back on it now, it is really strange to think of who he actually was. I don't think it is in the realm of what normal human brains can comprehend, but just the day before we met up, the guy I was out on that first date with had murdered a girl in his hotel room, a British girl called Grace Mullane. The reason he brought up his friend accidentally strangling his girlfriend is because that's exactly how he'd killed her, although whether or not it was on purpose is another question entirely. Also, the reason he'd mentioned the Waitakere mountain range is because that's where he ended up disposing of her body, and all that other stuff about sniffer dogs was research that he'd been doing the previous night that was still sort of consuming his mind. It is hard to look back and think that that had just happened to her. From what I understand, while we were on our date, her body was still in that hotel room of his, hidden under the bed or something, wrapped in a blanket. There's nothing I could have done, and I know that now, but it is still really hard to come to terms with that. I do think if it had been a date in the evening, potentially I could have been a victim. I take a lot of solace in the fact that I do have my wits about me and do take safety and online dating quite seriously, and that is nothing against any women who are willing to go home with someone on the first date, but I do want to say to young women to take one more step in your thinking when you're on a date to see how well you know this person actually. Since then, I have been on dates with lovely, trustworthy men, but think, how well do I really know them? It has made me go a little slower and divulge a little less personal information to them. I know in modern dating it is quite common to give people your Instagram handle, but you are giving people access to a lot of personal information. It is really dangerous, and I just want to encourage people to take a step back and think before they do that. There's nothing wrong with taking a step back, taking it slow and pacing yourself a bit. Alcohol has a big effect. It is a part of the social fabric of dating and part of life these days, but it still comes with a massive risk. Women need to be really aware of how much they are drinking on dates, and unfortunately drinks are sometimes spiked. We live in this world where people are still idealistic about how things should be on dates, but incidents like these take things back 10 or 20 years, where women are still having to grip their keys between their fingers or can't leave a drink on the table. We aren't as developed as we think we are in areas such as dating. Technology has got ahead of us. I think people are as they always are. I think with the advancement of technology we thought we would become more refined, but we are just the same but with new technology. I think the invention of dating apps is a wonderful thing, and I wouldn't want to live in a world without that, but I just wish for a world where women don't have to think about their safety all the time. A few Christmases ago, I was driving my kids back from visiting their grandparents out in the countryside. They moved out to this big old house once my dad sold his business, one of those offers he couldn't refuse type things that meant he could retire like 10 years earlier than expected. The house is amazing, but the only problem is that it's in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the nearest village is like 20 minutes drive away. It's also one heck of a drive to and from the place, one that involves traversing some pretty secluded stretches of motorway. So like I said, it's maybe only a week before Christmas. It's the 16th or 17th of December, and my kids are really bloody excited about it. My wee lad is still 5 years old, a true Santa believer, while my daughter had only just turned 9, so they're starting to cotton on that something isn't quite right about the whole thing, but they still sort of want to believe, if that makes any sense. So when they see a hand-painted Christmas light dripping sign that says something like Santa's Grotto 9 miles, they start going ballistic in the back seat, demanding I take them to see Santa. At first, I straight up refuse. It was a long enough drive without pulling into some lay-by to spend the better part of an hour nattering away with some old fella in a red suit. But the pair of them throw an absolute fit, to the point where I decided I would get far more peace if I just capitulated and let them spend a few minutes indulging their childish imaginations. Like I said, my eldest was just on the cusp of figuring out that Santa was just Mom and Dad sneaking out in the middle of the night to take their presents out of the car boot before stashing them under the Christmas tree. And every time I imagined her getting older, getting wiser, figuring things out, becoming a young adult, it had me choking up like nobody's business. So I suppose I just wanted to enjoy their naivete just a wee bit longer. Besides, once she'd figured out the truth, it was only a matter of time before she spilled the beans to my youngest. And that was a day I most definitely wasn't looking forward to. So after a few more signs like Santa's Grotto 3 miles, I finally see the turnoff that I needed to take to get to the grotto. It takes me down this long, dark dirt track that at first I thought might have been the wrong turnoff. But lo and behold, after about 5 minutes or so, I see another one of those janky hand-painted signs for Santa's Grotto. The kids are just about ready to burst at this point, but I make it clear that we're not staying any longer than 10 minutes, and they're to be on their best behavior, leaving when I tell them to leave, lest Santa see what bad little children they are. The threat of coal in their stockings was more than enough to have them promising to be good. Anyway, I expected a quaint little winter wonderland type thing with a few other families milling around, but the place was barely even decorated and looked completely deserted. It was little more than Portakabin with a few caravans parked around it. Like, I'm not messing when I say whoever was in charge of this place had put more effort into decorating the road signs than the actual site itself. I had a bad feeling from the get-go, but I knew better than to reverse myself and tell the kids to get back in the car. They'd have gone absolutely mental getting so close to meeting Santa, only to be told that I'd just up and changed my mind. So, against my better judgment, I decided to give the place a chance. We walked up to the porta-cabin, which seems to be the place where the grotto was, and knocked on the door. There was no reply at first, so we knocked again, and as we did so, one of the doors to the caravan swings open, and this heavier-set older fellow with a big gray beard sticks his head out and gives me a death stare. I look over at him, and in my cheeriest voice I ask, "We're here to see Santa. Is he around?" I give a quick nod towards the kids as if to say the fella who I was guessing was the one playing Santa to get himself together so the kids wouldn't throw a fit. He doesn't say a word at first. He just stares at me almost like looking through me like there was nothing behind his eyes at all. He finally says something like, "I'll go fetch him," then shuts the door, only to re-emerge a few moments later dressed in what was without a doubt the worst-looking Santa suit I've ever seen in my life. Not only was it lacking any kind of white felt, there was no belt or anything. The bloke had pretty much just thrown together a collection of red clothes and then whacked on a cheap Santa hat to round the look off. On top of that, the clothes were absolutely filthy, covered in grease stains with a collection of what appeared to be his cigarette burns in the pants. He walked towards the kids and asked them if they were excited to see him. They gave each other this cartoonish look as if to say, "Who is this guy?" And the bloke has to repeat the question in a characteristically festive voice before they even really twig to the fact that this was Santa Claus. They just sort of nod at first, watching in confusion as he takes out the key from the red pants and unlocks the porta-cabin before beckoning them inside. The interior was absolutely terrifying. Like, I'm a grown woman, and even I got the creeps from stepping inside that thing. It was dark and grimy, and the use of cheap Christmas lights managed to give the place a kind of festive torture chamber type vibe, as opposed to the cozy grotto feeling they were obviously aiming for. The crowning piece of creepiness was the fact that, mounted on one wall, was what I guessed was an old sheep's skull that had some plastic deer antlers taped or glued to the top of it. It would have been creepy enough in broad daylight, but the fact that it was being partially, then fully illuminated by red and green flashing lights gave it a truly hellish aesthetic. Santa sat down on a grubby old couch that stunk of pee and old ale, then smacked his knees as if to invite the kids to go sit on his lap. Neither of them moved. Their lack of reaction prompted Santa to give them something of a scowl before he very curtly asked them what each of them wanted for Christmas. Both of the kids were so nervous by that point that I had to prompt them to reply. The awkward exchange went on for a few more minutes until I turned to the kids and told them we had to leave. As I'm ushering the kids out of the porta-cabin and back towards the car, I feel a hand grab the crook of my arm and squeeze. I turn to see Santa's face pushed right into mine, his breath reeking of ciggies and hard booze. "50 quid, he hissed. "Sorry, Santa, I haven't got anything on me," I said, trying to be as polite as possible, maintaining a passive-aggressive tone. "But I promise me and my husband will leave out some extra brandy and mince pies for you on Christmas night, just to make up for it." I don't even know I was keeping up the pretense by that point. I'm pretty sure the whole experience had scarred my wee lad for life and had pretty much destroyed any remaining festive belief in my daughter. Santa growled back at me, calling me an expletive. I just keep pushing my kids back towards the car, turning back briefly to see that Santa is no longer alone. He was never alone. A gang of other people have filed out of the caravans and are following us back towards where I'd parked the car, then starts off the chorus of, "Where do you think you're going, love? You haven't paid. He told you 50 quid, get your purse out, or we'll get it out for you." My kids were on the verge of tears at that point, and if I'm being honest, I wasn't far off either. I gave in, took out my purse, and started sifting through it to see if I had 50 in notes on me. Right as I'm doing that, this kid, this actual bloody child, just snatches the whole thing out of my hand and runs back towards the caravan with it, only to be goaded on by the gang of skanky-looking grown-ups going, "Good lad, that'll teach her. She needs to learn some generosity. It is Christmas, after all." I didn't do a bloody thing. Well, aside from getting in the car and driving off. The damage control from that bit of horribleness was a lot of work. I'm pretty sure it was the singular event that broke my eldest kid's belief, and we had to reassure my youngest over and over that he was just a bad man pretending to be Santa, and that the real Santa would most definitely be putting him on the naughty list for what he'd done. But honestly, I think it's me that belongs on the naughty list for putting my kids in that position in the first place, and for putting myself in the most terrifying Christmas-related event I'd ever gone through. Far, far scarier than my first Christmas with my mother-in-law, if you can believe that. I go to an all-girls boarding school, and there are 9 junior and 4 senior boarding houses. The junior houses are for girls between 11 to 16, and the senior houses are for girls 16 to 18. At the beginning of September 2016, I moved out of my junior house into my new senior house, which, for the sake of not bringing my school into this, we'll call Robinson. Robinson was different from the other houses in that you only stayed for a year, but that you stayed with another person in a double room, as opposed to the single rooms like other senior boarding houses, and I chose to share with my best friend, Georgia. For various reasons, I ended up going back to school 2 days early with only a handful of other girls. I get told to go to my room, and I discover that it's in the basement of the house, tucked into a corner with 2 other rooms. The minute I was in the room, I felt something was off, like really, really off. It was like there was this nasty aura in the room, like I wasn't alone in the room. I'm really into ghost stories and the paranormal, so all those stories started to kick in. That being said, I have pretty bad anxiety, so I told myself it was that and tried to ignore it. I unpacked, and since Georgia isn't there yet, I get to pick which one of the beds, which desk, and which drawers I want. I chose one that's on the far side of the room, with the end facing the open doorway that leads to the space where you can either turn right and go to the toilet, or go left and go to the door to the rest of the house. This room is absolutely huge, so I can space out my stuff, and I'm pretty happy about it. At about 9, I decide that enough's enough and I should go to sleep. I turn the main lights out and get into bed and try to go to sleep and pull the duvet over my head. I then proceed to spend the next 5 hours absolutely terrified. That feeling that something's in the room is amplified 1,000 times, and it's made worse by the fact that I can hear things, shuffling in the dark, soft scratching on the carpet, and creaks of people sitting on wood. I'm absolutely sure that I've heard someone breathing near my head at some point during the night. I'm so terrified that I have to psych myself up to even change position, sure that something will jump onto me. I'm exhausted in the morning, and when I finally woke up, I realized that although it's not as strong or as powerful as during the night, the feeling that something is in the room with me is still there. It's awful, like something is hanging onto my back and waiting for me to turn my back so it can jump at me. My roommate comes back about 3 days later, and I notice she hardly seems to notice the atmosphere in the room, which seems so painfully obvious to me, and happily puts away all of her stuff. That feeling that there's something in the room was honestly terrifying. I couldn't study in silence. I had to have music on so that I could attempt to block out this feeling, and I always left my phone on with YouTube videos playing when I had to go to the toilet, just to make me feel like if I came back out into the room, I wouldn't have to see something standing in the room, silently waiting for me. It sounds really stupid, but it was the only way I could reassure myself. The feeling that I was being watched was always most clearer at night. It's probably because I was on my own and didn't have anything else to do but try and go to sleep, but whatever reason, it genuinely scared me. I'd asked in other rooms in the house. There are 4 floors in total, including the basement, and been into other rooms, and it feels like a nice normal room, and nobody in them ever felt like they were ever being watched. The worst place where it happened was the open doorway, the one that my bed faces. In the beginning, it was easy to ignore, the feeling of being watched only happening every now and then, but as time went on, it got worse and worse. At the worst, it felt as though a grown man was standing in the doorway, barring the way, staring at my bed, and it was as though I could physically feel the presence there. It was so strong. One night, when it was particularly bad, I tried to shrug it off and get to sleep. I have a habit of bringing up one leg to my chest for a bit and then bringing it back down. That night, I brought my leg up, felt the presence, brushed it off, and began to lower my leg back down. As I did, to my absolute horror, I felt the edge of the mattress sink downwards, as though somebody had suddenly sat on it, and I felt what felt like a hand resting on top of my foot. Straight away, I brought my legs to my chest and curled up like that for the rest of the night. I was really on edge from that, so for the next few weeks I made sure to check the doorway before to reassure myself that there's nothing there. About 3 weeks later, Georgia and I are talking about a play we both like, and since our beds are on the opposite sides of the room, I sometimes couldn't make out what she was saying. Anyways, Georgia makes some point, and I couldn't hear what she said, so I turned over from my position of facing the wall and lift up the duvet to face her bed. I lift my head, and I see a dark shadow above her desk of drawers, floating above the books she has on top of it. We had the curtains open, so a streak of light from a street lamp was shining through the window into our room, since our windows open out onto the car park, and in it, I could see the shadow was in the shape of a head and shoulders, with the head facing the window, all in pitch-dark shadow, so I couldn't make out any features but what seemed to be a prominent Roman nose. I freaked out, yanked the duvet over my head and faced the wall. It felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be there. It really set me off, and since then I got really wary of something actually being in the room, and there are 2 other incidences that occurred and convinced it for me that something was in the room. The first was when I was under my desk, looking for some socks to wear to dinner, and as I dragged myself out of the desk, I reached behind me for my jumper and glanced to see where it was. And as I did, I got a glimpse of a light blue woolen peacoat standing directly behind me, just above my shoulder, so close that I saw the way the light glinted in the buttons, and I could only make out just that the arms of the coat were inside the pockets. I stood up as fast as I could, and I saw that the coat, and presumably the wearer, had vanished. I didn't even hesitate and just legged it out of the place, and refused to go back in for another hour until I knew that my roommate was back in the house. The worst incident was also the last. It was Sunday morning, and we're allowed lions. I was asleep when suddenly I became aware of the fact that I was asleep and lying in bed. I suppose it's what you could call a lucid dream, but I'm not sure as it's never actually happened to me before. I didn't have enough time to focus on it because next thing I knew, there was a feeling of something being near me, and then a feeling that something was by my head, and I felt a presence standing by my head, leaning over me, so solid that it felt like another human being was right there, even through the fog of my sleeping mind. I didn't have enough time to realize what was happening until I felt a hand, a solid, warm human hand, touch my head and the bit just under my ears and start to stroke it. And I swear to Christ and back again that a voice began to make a noise in my ear, like a weird moaning sound, or like someone was sobbing with their mouth closed, muffling the sounds of sobs. I wasn't sure if it was real, but I sure wasn't taking any chances if it wasn't a dream, so I twisted myself away from it and screamed out loud, "Georgia! Georgia!" Georgia bolted up and looked around as I tore my covers off and looked around my area. She looked really confused, as though she hadn't seen anything, and I thought that maybe it had been a dream, until I noticed that my wall calendar that was pinned up to my notice board above my head had been ripped off the wall and was lying on the floor by my bed, despite the fact that it was definitely pinned up securely the night before. It never got as bad as that again. The feeling of being watched slowly began to stop after that, and the negative aura in the room and the small sounds I would have heard in the night started to stop as well. And when I came back from the Christmas holidays in January, it was barely here. The presents had all but vanished, and it felt like the rest of the dorm rooms in Robinson. Over Christmas, I decided to do a bit of research into Robinson to figure out what could explain what was going on. I found out that Robinson has been a hotel before my boarding school had purchased it, which is why the rooms were so big and why they still had ensuite bathrooms, and you could actually still see the old wallpaper that had been painted over in some of the rooms. The town where my school is was a really big place for spying and espionage during the Cold War, and it still to this day has strong links to British espionage, and this hotel was very close to places where this would have definitely occurred. The coat I saw matches exactly the kind of coats worn by the Navy during the 1960s. So from what I gathered, and since getting information about the detailed workings of the British government during the 60s is kind of difficult, I like to think that maybe it's the ghosts of someone who lost their life in my room when it was still a hotel during the Cold War, and they're still stuck here, waiting until they can pass on.
I'm in my late 60s, and I grew up in the Bronx. The Bronx isn't exactly known for supernatural activity, but I can tell you from living there for many years, a lot of strange things happen in New York, aside from the drug abuse and the crime that takes place in the back alleys. Let's go back in time to 1962. It was my 7th birthday. My grandmother got me this vintage Mattel Jack-in-the-Box. This was back when these kinds of toys were more commonplace. From the moment I opened the gift, I immediately got a bad feeling. Jack-in-the-Boxes are naturally creepy to some people, and I was never a fan of them, even as a kid. But I loved it when my grandmother came up from Brooklyn to visit us, and if I even hinted that I didn't like the toy she got me, my mother would have made sure I didn't sit down for a week. I don't know where my grandmother got this thing, but if I had to guess, she probably got it from one of the several pawn shops in the area. I think this is significant to point out, because this means that the toy was not bought brand new. It had a previous owner. After my birthday celebration was over, me and my dad put all of my presents in my room. I specifically remember setting the Jack-in-the-Box down in my toy chest. My family had this tradition where we would always gather in the living room and listen to some radio shows before going to bed. When 8 o'clock rolled around, I was told to brush my teeth and go to bed. When I was done in the washroom and went into my bedroom to turn in, I instantly noticed that the Jack-in-the-Box was now resting at the foot of my bed. I was confused because I remembered putting it away in my toy chest, but I figured that one of my parents might have been messing with me, so I placed the toy under my bed and tucked myself in. I ended up having these violent, horrifying nightmares over the next following weeks. I remembered seeing unspeakable things in my dreams. Everything is obscure to me now from the passing of time and my mind trying to block out certain things, but I'm confident that what I saw in my dreams was of a sexual nature. I would wake up screaming many times, to the point where my mother ended up taking me to the doctors to find out what was wrong. The doctors performed several tests on me and concluded that I was perfectly healthy and recommended that I be taken to a child psychologist. The night that I got back from the doctors was when this whole situation would reach its climax and conclusion. Maybe it's obvious to everyone listening to this what was going on, but at the time, I didn't really have a clue. I woke up that night, not from a nightmare, but from that feeling you get when someone is watching you. I had a nightlight plugged in next to my bed. In the dim light, I saw the Jack-in-the-Box my grandmother had gotten for me resting at the foot of my bed. That's when the unthinkable happened. It was like a scene straight out of a horror film. The crank on the side of the box slowly began to turn, and a distorted, slowed-down version of the melody began to play. When the tune finished, the clown inside the box popped out. Even though I saw it coming, it still made me jump. However, there was something else that I noticed that instantly made me forget all about the creepy little plastic clown. Recalling this now still makes my insides crawl. Looming just behind the toy box was a tall black figure. The only thing I could tell you about this shadowy presence is that it had these long horns on top of its head. I was raised Catholic, but I was never told at that point in my life about the fallen angel Lucifer, or his foot soldiers, commonly referred to as demons. My fragile little mind could not comprehend what I was witnessing, but I remembered my teachings about God's love and the power of prayer. So I closed my eyes and began to pray aloud. Shortly after I began my prayer, I heard a loud shrieking, as if I was inflicting pain to whatever was in my room. As soon as I opened my eyes, I saw that the figure was gone. The box that was still resting at the foot of my bed was now closed. We lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. Outside of my room was one of those stereotypical dark alleys New York City is known for. I opened up my bedroom window and hurled the box out. As soon as I threw it, I was expecting to hear it crash on the concrete below. But instead, I heard what can only be described as giant wings flapping. I didn't see anything, but I felt a gust of cold air hit me, and I quickly shut my window and ran back under the covers. I'm sharing my story to inform everyone that there are dark forces out there beyond our comprehension. You'll be surprised to hear that I'm no longer a part of any organized religion. I'm still a very spiritual person, and I do believe in a higher power. If you're confused by this, I'll try to break this down for you in the simplest of terms. Dark entities, like the one I encountered so many years ago, are comprised of energy, and they react to other energies in different ways. If you show fear in the face of adversary, they will feed off that fear and become stronger. If you show bravery and perform an act like prayer as a means to combat the presence, that is what ultimately drives them out. I believe wholeheartedly that you don't have to belong to a church or a certain religion to deal with an intruding presence. It was this event that inspired me to become both a counselor and a paranormal investigator. I have used my experiences with the paranormal to help many families across America. So if you ever encounter one of these dark spirits in your home, remember my words. Do not show fear. Be brave. And make it clear that they are not welcomed.
The 80s were a crazy time in my life. I'm not proud to admit that I was a major drug addict back then. I've since reformed and I've turned my life around. I've been sober since 1990. This story was my wake-up call and the main reason that I left that life behind. Back then, I was working as a window washer in Birmingham, Alabama. I lived in a small apartment just outside the city. In those days, a lot of contraband came through there, and I was kinda sorta friends with my dealer. We'll call him Chris. I've known Chris since high school. He was always a bad seed, and had a criminal record the length of my arm, which is to be expected in this line of business. We had a sort of standoffish relationship. He tried several times to get me to hang out with him at parties, and go to bars and whatnot, but I always declined because I never fully trusted him. However, as my addiction became worse, I began to let my guard down more and more. It was on a Friday night. I remember this clearly because I had just gotten paid, and being the pathetic addict I was, I called up Chris as soon as I cashed my check.
Hello.
Hey Chris, it's Richie. Are we good for a meetup?
Yeah, I need you to meet me somewhere else tonight.
Why?
Because I don't want to get busted selling this shit to you in the same fucking place over and over again. The police came and knocked on my door this morning, accusing me of slinging dope.
Oh shit, really?
Yeah, and it's a good thing I don't keep my stash in my house, or I would have been fucked. But they are watching me, and I think someone is running their mouth.
Chris, I'd never...
Look, just shut up and drive out to the abandoned church. Be there by 7.
Chris abruptly hung up.
The church Chris referred to is located roughly 30 minutes outside the city, towards Coburg. I had only been there once back in high school when a mutual friend of ours had a keg party there. I thought he was overly paranoid, wanting to meet me all the way out there, but I had to play by his rules since he was the one with the supply. I made the drive out there and was sitting in my truck outside the abandoned church, which was nothing but a heap of charred remains barely standing. That party I mentioned took place in 1981, so someone took it upon themselves to torch the place since then. This was before cell phones, so I pretty much just sat there and listened to the radio while I waited for Chris to show up. I looked at the clock on my dashboard, and saw that almost an hour had gone by since I arrived, and there was still no sign of Chris. It was now dark out as well, which was making me feel uneasy. This church was off of a back road near Interstate 22, which was practically in the middle of nowhere. There were no streetlights or anything out there. It was when I was thinking about how if anyone was outside, the only thing that they would see is my truck's cab light, that I started to feel like a sitting duck. I tried starting up my truck to get out of there, but my dumbass had nearly drained the battery by sitting there with my radio on. As I tried turning the engine over, I got the feeling that eyes were watching me, and I turned on my headlights. I looked up, and a wave of dread overcame me as my headlights illuminated a horrifying sight. Standing in front of my truck were 3 figures. The first thing that my mind was able to register was a pair of antlers on top of a deer head, and for a split second, I thought maybe a trio of deer were standing in front of my truck. But as I looked closer, I saw the figures were standing upright, and I came to the horrifying realization that what I was looking at were 3 men dressed in deer skins. I began to panic and started to turn the key in the ignition. I didn't know who these deer skin wearing freaks were, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. As the sound of the engine failing to start rang out, I watched in terror as the 3 figures began to move closer. "Come on, you piece of shit!" I yelled as I slammed my foot on the gas pedal while continuing to try and start my truck. With each attempt, the headlights flickered, and as the figures slowly closed in, I could see that the middle one was holding a shotgun. I closed my eyes and began to pray for God to help me out of this situation while pressing down on the gas pedal. Suddenly I heard the sound of the engine roaring to life. I didn't have time to be relieved, as I quickly threw the vehicle into reverse and hauled ass. I looked up to see the deer people were much closer than they had been before, but that's not what scared me. What scared me was the shotgun pointed directly at me. Not a second later, I heard a gunshot, and I felt a hard thud as one of my headlights was blown out. I did not stop the truck as I quickly backed out to the back road and then floored it all the way back to town. When I got back home, I immediately called Chris, but there was no answer. The next day I drove out to Chris's trailer and knocked on his door, but no one came. I didn't know what to make of the situation, and I decided to call out of work for a week and lay low. Chris was found 2 weeks later, on the side of a road about 15 miles away from that abandoned church. He had been bludgeoned to death. I came to the police with my story and told them about what happened to me, but the death of a known drug dealer wasn't exactly a priority for them. They did, however, try to get me to confess to killing Chris multiple times, even after I showed them the damage to my truck. I could see the writing on the wall. The police were too lazy to investigate the case, so they tried to pin it on me, using my drug addiction to support their bullshit theory. They harassed me with parking tickets and stakeouts until I finally moved away a year later. I still have no idea who those deer people were, but I'm convinced that they were the ones who killed Chris. My guess is that Chris got to the church before I did, and they ambushed him. To this day, I'm grateful to be alive. The moral of the story is that you should stay away from drugs. Not only will they destroy your life, but they will also put you into dangerous situations like this one. If I were to give this story a title, I'd call it Scared Straight.
I must apologize first because English is not my first language, so I'm sorry for any mistakes there in writing this. I'm from Paraguay, and I live here in the capital city, Asunción. Like many of the countries in the world, we in Paraguay have also been affected by the virus outbreak. Everyone is very worried. They have been wearing masks and buying all of the groceries so that they can stay at home until everything is safe again. But more importantly, the government here in Paraguay has declared a curfew, and people who leave their homes without a good reason can be punished by the police. Also, if you leave your home and you are sick, you can be charged with a crime and thrown into jail. But the problem is that a lot of people in here in Asuncion are very poor, and even those who work make very little money. That means that both me and my father have to work to support our family. Even my mother makes and sells wicker baskets in her free time to give our family extra money. But that's where the trouble started. When the government here decided which of our jobs were essential and which ones were not. I had a part-time job in the tourism industry, giving guided tours of the markets and historical sites of Asuncion. But this was declared non-essential right away after the lockdown was declared. So just like that, I was out of work. My father is a supervisor at a manufacturing plant on the outskirts of the city. So for a while he was still able to bring home money since he was declared an essential worker. But that all changed when he was tested at his job for the virus. When the test came back positive, he was told he would have to go home and isolate himself for 2 weeks before he would be allowed to return to work. This was a disaster for our family, but there was one flicker of hope. The head of my father's department told him that a temporary replacement had been found for him, but that left a space on the factory floor, one that I could occupy for the time he was sick. So every morning for about a week, I would wake up very early, grab my father's ID card, walk out of town for an hour so I could work the line at the manufacturing plant. It was a very boring job, much more boring than my tour guide work, but I was still very grateful to have the chance to keep earning money for my family. My family owns a car that we share, but since money was low and we couldn't afford too much gas, we had to save it for emergencies. That is why, like I may have said already, that I ended up walking 4 miles there in the morning and 4 miles back home in the nighttime. It was tough going, and I was stopped by the police many times, but all I had to do was show them my father's factory ID card and they would wave me on. But that only worked so many times, and one evening a routine police check led to one of the most terrifying, stressful experiences of my entire life. I was walking at the side of the road, my feet aching after a long day on the line, when I heard the momentary blare of a siren behind me. I stopped walking, turned around, and I saw a police vehicle parking up near me. Usually I would just show the ID card and the police would drive on without getting out of their car. But this time, both officers stepped out of the vehicle and began marching towards me with a lot of aggression. I tried to show them the ID card to explain that I was an essential worker working in place of my father, but they didn't want to listen. "This is not your picture," one of the officers said, asserting that I could not be a supervisor and suggesting that I had in fact stolen the ID from somebody. I swore to him that it was not true, that I had made arrangements and my family might starve without the income. Then they searched me. When I asked what they were looking for, one of the officers got in my face and told me to shut my mouth, that I was lucky that they weren't just taking me to jail since I was out spreading the virus. I think they were searching me for drugs, but I can't be sure. I know a lot of dealers have been caught recently since they need to sell their stuff and have trouble explaining why they are outdoors during a lockdown. When they had finished their search and found nothing, I thought that they might just let go of me, but I was terrified to see one of the officers take out their electric taser gun, arm it, and aim it in my direction. I didn't think. I just raised my hands like it was second nature, showing him I meant them no harm and praying he wouldn't pull the trigger. The other officer reached into the pocket of his uniform, taking out his phone and pointing the camera in my direction. It was clear that he was filming me, but for what purpose, I was scared to know. I really thought I was going to be tased on camera, that they used the video as an example to others. Then the officer with the camera said something that I struggled to understand at first. 50 star jumps, right now. At first, I honestly thought I didn't hear his words correctly. These were words I had not heard since high school physical education class. I told the officer I didn't understand, but this only made him furious. "Are you deaf? Or just stupid, boy?" He barked at me. 50 star jumps. Go, hurry. I simply did as I was told. I started doing the star jumps while the officers laughed, commenting that this is what happens to those that break curfew without a good reason. Repeat after me," one of them said. "I'm sorry, officer. I will not leave my house again." I'm sorry, officer. I will not leave my house again," I repeated. "Again." And I did so. "Again." I said the words and jumped on the spot until I had no more breath in my lungs. I was still convinced that they would tase me when it was done, that the punishment wasn't over. But when I collapsed, feet and lungs burning from the work, they just carried on laughing as they got back into their car and drove away. These hard times are difficult enough without horrible policemen taking advantage of their power. I know they're not like that all over the world, that there are always a few bad people to many good ones, but I just pray that no one else has to go through what I suffered that evening. Good luck, everyone, and be safe. Like a lot of people, I was pretty shocked when the government declared a lockdown here in the UK. I'm in my late 20s, so never in my life, or any of my mates' lives, have any of us experienced such a zealous curtailing of civil liberties. The lines at supermarkets began. Road traffic dropped off to next to nothing. It's been a soft transformation of society, but a transformation nonetheless. As life changed, so did living arrangements, and one day, I noticed that the girl who lived alone in the flat below me wasn't so alone anymore. I passed her on the stairs at one point, backing off into a corridor to maintain social distancing, but noticed she wasn't alone. He was a harmless-looking bloke at first, quite tall but skinny with a mess of curly, sandy blonde hair. I said hi, introduced myself without all the usual handshaking, and went on my way. Everything was hunky-dory, if I'm being perfectly honest. That was until last Friday night, when something happened that gave this whole lockdown thing a whole new meaning of terrifying. It started with a few bumps and groans from downstairs. I was playing Xbox at the time, whiling the hours away with that new Call of Duty Warzone game with a few mates. The floors and walls in this old Victorian flat share are pretty thick, but make a loud enough noise and you can hear the bass in another apartment. So when I feel the flat shake a wee bit and hear the girl's voice, I roll my eyes and assume the worst. "Uh-oh," I said down the mic. "I think the girl downstairs and her fella are getting a bit familiar." This sparked off a round of laughter and off-colored humor, and I ended up turning my TV volume up to drown out any potential sounds of copulation. It was annoying, but hey, I've got my way of killing the quarantine time. I suppose they found theirs. But it didn't end there. Soon, loud, sporadic banging sounds from the flat below was making my flat literally shake. It was actually kind of alarming. I mean, Christ almighty, those pairs seemed like they were really going at it. I mentioned it to my mates in the party chat, and we all had a little laugh at the whole thing. But then something happened that meant I wasn't laughing anymore. I heard the girl cry out. And I know what you're thinking, but trust me, if you heard what I did, you'd have known something wasn't quite right too. It wasn't a cry of ecstasy, not in the least bit, but it sounded hurt, weak, terrified. As I said, I'd turned down the volume on my TV to block the sounds out, but now I was turning it right down again, muting the speakers so I could better hear what was going on. There were voices all right, and they were obviously trying to stay hushed, but you could clearly hear that some kind of heated argument was taking place. I mentioned this to the lads in the party chat, and yet again they made off-colored comments like, "Sounds kinky," just nonsense like that. But I quickly made it clear that this was something else entirely, and that I was actually kind of worried about the whole thing. We're literally talking about the prospect of it being some kind of domestic violence incident when there's yet another loud bang, so hard it makes my flat shake. Only this one was followed by a similarly terrified female scream. Then there was silence. My heart is absolutely pounding at this stage. Right then, one of the lads makes a joke about smelling something funny coming from the flat below in the next couple of days, and how I might end up being the guest star of some sort of true crime documentary in the near future. Now, I like my dark humor, and I admit I'd have found that kind of thing funny if it wasn't in danger of actually happening. But given the circumstances, I was absolutely terrified. There were no more noises coming from the flat below. It was eerily quiet now. So I asked the lads in the party chat to bear with me because I was going to call the police. Immediately, a few of them told me it was the right thing to do, that it's always better to be safe than sorry in this situation. So I do, and the dispatcher on the other end tells me to leave the front door of the building open so they can enter safely and deal with the whole situation. Only get this. The police arrive. I hear a lot of shouting downstairs, so I walk out into the hallway of the building to listen in on what's going on. Instead of actually getting in there and dealing with the whole situation, the police seem to be happy to just talk to the couple through the door of the flat. The whole social distancing thing hadn't occurred to me in the slightest when I called, and now the problem with my solution was becoming evident. The couple, within moments of the police arrival, had gone from at each other's throats to uniting to tell the police to get out of their building. They were actually shouting about a warrant and all this stuff, basically trying to find any reason to keep them out. It was nuts. I had read and heard about domestic abuse before, and this was one of the classic symptoms. Warring couples suddenly unite when someone else tries to intervene. They demand to know who'd made the call, and what I heard next had me emitting an actual "uh-oh" out loud. The cops bloody well told them. They straight up said, "We received a call from the flat above you." They had dropped me right in it. It was quiet for the rest of the night, and the next day I tried to avoid them entirely, but eventually I had to leave the flat to buy food. And as I did, and was walking down the stairs towards the front door of our building, the girl below's flat opens up, and I see a figure standing in the doorway. He was wearing a mask, one of those surgical ones. They've been popular since the outbreak, but it's clearly the abusive boyfriend, and he's holding a hammer, a bloody claw hammer, and he's just staring at me. I raise my hands and try to explain that I only meant well, but he just slams the door on me before I can finish my explanation. And that's how it's been for the past few days now. Me being completely terrified for my life, locking my doors constantly and listening out for heavy footsteps coming up the stairs towards my flat. So seriously, if anyone has any advice or examples on how to deal with this, please leave them in the comments. I'll be reading every single one and responding to those I think can help via DM. Life can be very hard here in the Philippines. And here in Quezon, the largest city in my country, and the place where I live, life has gotten even harder since one man came to power back in 2016. Rodrigo Roa Duterte. He is often described in the same way as the American president Donald Trump. People say he is a populist and an agitator, but honestly, our president makes Trump look like an angel. Duterte has been a very vocal supporter of the extrajudicial killings of drug dealers and those that do business with them. I know that certain human rights organizations have estimated that Duterte has been directly and indirectly responsible for almost 1,500 murders committed by what has been come to be known as the Davao death squads. There, they murdered without a care, even sometimes targeting children in their attempt to clean up the streets. It was bad back then, but it got even worse after 2016 when he became president, and the more I think about it, the more it seems like his entire reign was building up to today, when extenuating circumstances have meant that he has more power than ever before. Quezon has reacted to the COVID-19 crisis in a very similar way to other places. We have lockdowns, mandatory self-isolation, and food rationing. And naturally, the police force has been granted considerably more power in light of such an extreme health emergency. It seems to be quite a unique situation, in that the government has increased powers and civil liberties have all but been suspended. And yet, there is absolutely no outrage or protest from the people. They are scared, and scared people are very, very easy to control. They don't just accept the introduction of draconian punishment, they welcome it. And for me, a firm believer in human rights, it is a very, very scary time indeed. For example, just a few days ago I was walking to the market to buy essential food supplies when I saw a large crowd gathered near the market square. Hundreds of people were jostling for position to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that was hidden from my view, and they were quickly being dispersed by police who obviously were under orders not to let people congregate at all. When the crowd thinned out, only then could I see what they were looking at. It was a small cage, maybe only a couple of square feet in size, no higher than a man's thigh. I recognized it as a dog cage from the sturdy steel bars, the kind us Filipinos keep our pets in to keep them safe at night. But there was no dog in the cage. It was a man. He looked terrible, like he'd not eaten or slept in days, and worst of all, this was all taking place under the midday sun. He was being baked alive in public, with only the police throwing the occasional cup of water over him to keep him from passing out from heat stroke. I was in shock. I just stood there for a moment as masked individuals filed past me, staring at the man's fingers as he hooked them through the bars of the cage and begged for help. Too big, he said over and over again. Water, water. A masked policeman approached him, tossing another cup of lukewarm water over the cage's bars. The man reacted like an animal, lapping at the bars of the cage to catch a few droplets in his mouth, trying to catch what little he could on his fingers and palms, then licking them desperately out of pure manic thirst. The police just laughed as he did so. But I didn't. I couldn't even move. All I could do was stare at a man who had been reduced to something less than human, and it probably hadn't even taken that long to do it. Some people were recording the man on their phones from a distance, taking pictures to send to relatives and friends. I didn't even have to ask why he was locked in that cage like that, because the policemen didn't waste time to tell me. "Leave the area," one shouted at me, pointing towards the small steel cage, "or you'll end up just like him. Tell everyone this is what happens when people don't practice social distancing," said another. I turned and walked away very quickly, not slowing my pace until I reached the market square. When I was done, I walked straight back home, not stopping, almost flaunting my bags of groceries to any police officers that gave me looks. There was no way I was ending up in a cage like that poor man. Even if he had violated social distancing rules, there was no good reason to cage him like an animal. But the thing is, that's not even the scariest thing I've heard or seen in the past few weeks. In Cavite province, just south of Manila, 2 small children were forcibly locked inside an actual coffin on March 26th as punishment for violating curfew. In Binondo village, officials arrested 4 boys and 4 girls on March 19th for violating curfew. They forcibly cut the hair of 7 of the children while the one who resisted was stripped naked and ordered to walk home. And these aren't just rumors either. These are things that I have seen videos of on WhatsApp. The Philippines already has a terrible record of criminalizing children, with members of Congress attempting to lower the age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 12, with some having proposed it to be lowered to 9. If enacted, this could put more and younger children behind bars in dangerous detention facilities. And speaking of rumors, in October 2017, Rodrigo Duterte opposed passing a law against so-called fake news, saying that it would be unconstitutional as it can curtail freedom of speech. But just a few weeks ago, our president passed a law saying those who spread fake COVID-19 news may have their electronic devices confiscated, face jail time, and in some cases even be landed with an enormous 1 million Philippine peso fine. That's the equivalent of about $40,000. That's a punishment that could destroy someone's life, as we are not wealthy people here in the Philippines. I understand lies are bad and that scaremongering can cause panic, but To destroy someone's life for that is a horrifying prospect. But it only took a few days before destroying someone's life took on a very literal meaning. On this past Thursday, a 63-year-old man was shot dead after threatening village officials and police with a scythe at a virus checkpoint. Official news sources stated that the man is believed to have been drunk when he threatened village officials and police manning the checkpoint in the town of Nasipit in the southern province of Agusan del Norte. The suspect was cautioned by a village health worker for not wearing a face mask, the report said. But the suspect got angry, uttering provoking words, and eventually attacked the personnel using a scythe. A lot of people here don't quite understand what is going on, only that there is an infectious disease, but not exactly how incredibly virulent it is. So please, I hear a lot of people complaining that it's very fascist to shut down society in such a way, but be grateful you are not in the Philippines, where we are just as much in danger because of our government as the virus. So before this whole lockdown thing happened and my dating life went to hell in a handbasket, I used to swipe through Tinder and Bumble quite a lot, looking for girls to hook up with. So I'm bored in my silver-like apartment one day when I come across this absolute smoke show of a girl who was listed under the name Lilith. She had these big green eyes, wore pigtails a lot in her profile pictures, and had absolutely no qualms of showing off this big peachy butt she had. She also had this goth girl vibe going, which was something I find really attractive. I mean, she was definitely not the kind of girl I'd bring home to mom, but that's not really what I'm looking for when I'm swiping, so naturally, I swipe right. Boom, we match. I think I actually let out this involuntary "no way" when the old "it's a match" text appeared, and kind of cynically told myself, nah, she's a bot, this isn't real. But yup, it was real, and she was so cute to talk to. At first, anyway, because things started to go a little different when we actually met up. She worked at this coffee shop at the Getty and asked me if I wanted to pick her up after her shift so she could take me somewhere real special, which turned out to be the Museum of Death on Hollywood Boulevard. I mean, not my ideally romantic place to go on a first date, but like I said, she was a slam piece, and it was basically impossible to say no to her. So it was decided, and after I picked her up, she kept it a mystery for a while, only telling me to drive her to Hollywood Boulevard before revealing where she actually wanted to go. The area around the museum is kind of sketchy, but again, I'd have driven through way worse neighborhoods for a date with this girl, so I just pushed all my concerns to the back of my mind. Despite the interior being as dark and dingy as it was, looking like an over-clustered basement, the whole thing was actually kind of interesting at first. But I'd be lying if I said my eyes stayed on the exhibits the whole time, when they were pretty much glued to her butt whenever I wasn't going to get caught looking. It most definitely wasn't particularly creepy either, but the things that Lilith started to say to me as we were walking around the place did in a big, bad way too. Like I said, the exhibits were interesting, but that's all they were aside from being gross and spooky. There were death masks, body parts preserved in formaldehyde, all the things you might come to expect from a place called the Museum of Death, and then some. But this Lilith chick starts saying how pretty some of this stuff is, looking at it the way any other girl might look at a picture of a puppy or something. She then starts asking me all these weird questions about how I'd like to die. Yeah, how I'd like to die. I tell her I wouldn't like to die at all. I mean, it was legit the creepiest question I think I'd ever been asked, and she insists that everyone has a way they'd most want to die. I don't want to screw up the date or anything. She seemed crazy, and crazy girls can be real fun, if you catch my meaning, so I give her some throwaway response like, whatever way is most pain-free. She starts telling me how that was a boring answer and how she'd like to die of hypothermia because it apparently makes you feel all warm and sleepy towards the end. How some victims of hypothermia have even taken their clothes off before they died and just lay down in the snow or whatever before their heart stops beating. She also then gave me this long, in-depth speech about how taking another person's life would be better than even getting intimate, if you catch my drift. How that feeling of pure power must dwarf any feeling that drugs or alcohol have to offer. She then tells me how hot she thought it would be to watch me drown at the bottom of a pool while there's an audience and I'm totally naked. How it'd actually turn her on to see my final moments of desperation before my body went limp and floated around the tank. Then something about how the Vikings would make wings out of the skin on a person's back by peeling it off and spreading it out, calling it beautiful, how it was like art or something. When she's done telling me all of that, and I'm suitably freaked out, she starts calling me pet, and how she wanted me chained up at the end of her bed so she could do whatever she wanted with me. Now, any other girl, I'd think that was incredibly kinky, but after what Lilith had just talked about, I really didn't think what she had in mind for me involved any kind of pleasure whatsoever. When it came to driving her home, she actually told me to stop a few blocks away from her house because she didn't want me to know exactly where it was that she lived at, saying that you couldn't be too careful these days with all the psychos in the world who use dating apps. Yep, she said that to me after she'd spent like an hour talking about all the ways she'd want to die or how she'd watch me die. As soon as I got home, I blocked her number. I've never been more scared of anyone like that before, let alone a girl I wanted to hook up with. So, Lilith, if you're reading this, let's not meet again.